Before we drift away, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more calming sleep stories. Sweet dreams await. The rain had begun softly as the group of friends made their way through the dense forest, the path barely visible beneath the thick canopy above. The trees loomed tall, their branches twisted and gnarly, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with the wind. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of wet earth, moss, and pine. Each step felt like a step deeper into the heart of something ancient, something untamed. They had come here to escape, to disconnect from the world for a while, but now, as the sky grew darker and the rain began to fall more heavily, an uneasy silence had fallen over them. Their laughter from earlier in the day had faded, replaced by a quiet tension that none of them could shake off. They reached the clearing where the old lodge stood, its dark silhouette barely visible through the mist. The wooden structure was weathered, its windows broken and boarded up in places, as if the building had been abandoned long ago. But there was a faint glow coming from inside, a flickering light that beckoned them closer. The group hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to press on or turn back, but the pull of warmth and shelter was too strong. As they entered the lodge, the door creaked loudly, echoing in the stillness of the forest. Inside, the fire in the hearth crackled, sending shadows dancing across the walls. The room was cozy in its way, with worn armchairs and a long wooden table. Yet there was something off about it, an air of neglect that lingered in the corners, as though the lodge had been waiting for someone to return. They set down their bags, and one of them, Sarah, immediately went to the fire to stoke the flames higher, her movements quick and practiced. It wasn't long before they were seated around the fire, each with a drink in hand, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. Outside, the storm intensified, the wind howling through the trees as rain battered the windows. As they sat there, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was subtle at first, a tingling at the back of their necks, the sensation of eyes following their every move. No one spoke of it, but all of them felt it. The fire seemed to flicker with a life of its own, casting eerie shadows across the room. They tried to push the feeling aside, telling themselves it was just the storm playing tricks on their minds. But then came the first sound, faint at first like a soft scraping against wood. Everyone froze. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by a faint tapping. It was coming from the dark hallway that led deeper into the lodge, a place they hadn't ventured yet. Did anyone else hear that? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I heard it, Sarah replied, her eyes wide. What was that? No one answered. They all stared at the hallway, the flickering firelight casting long shadows over the walls. The tapping continued, growing more rhythmic now, like footsteps in a place that shouldn't have any. Someone, it seemed, was out there. But the lodge had been empty when they arrived, and there was no way anyone could have gotten in without them hearing. The group exchanged uneasy glances, the warmth of the fire no longer enough to chase away the creeping chill in the air. Sarah stood up slowly, her heart pounding in her chest as she made her way toward the hallway. Each step felt heavier, as though the floor itself was resisting her. Sarah, don't, Mark called out, but his voice was drowned by the storm outside, and she pressed on. The moment she reached the hallway, the tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed against her eardrums. She hesitated, her hand hovering just above the door that led into the lodge's darker, more forgotten spaces. The air in the hallway felt colder, as though the very walls were exhaling an ancient breath. Her fingers brushed the doorknob, and a strange vibration surged through her, a low hum that seemed to come from deep beneath the floorboards. With a deep breath, she turned the handle. The door opened with a slow creak, revealing a staircase that led down into the unknown. The dim light of the fire didn't reach this far, and the blackness seemed to swallow everything. Sarah stepped back, feeling the pull of something deeper, something older than the trees outside. Behind her, the others were now standing, watching in tense silence. What is it? Mark asked, his voice tight. Sarah didn't answer at first. Her eyes were locked on the staircase, and she felt as though something, or someone, was waiting for them down there. The sound of her breath was the only thing that broke the stillness. She stepped back again, but just before she could close the door, there was a sound, a sharp scrape that echoed from deep below. The group gasped, and then, with an unsettling certainty, Sarah closed the door. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, as if the forest itself was trying to break in. The fire sputtered, and for a moment, the room was plunged into near darkness. When the flames returned, they were dimmer, weaker, as though the lodge itself was being drawn into something much older and more powerful than it seemed. The tapping sound had returned, louder now, and it was no longer coming from the hallway. It was coming from somewhere inside the walls, moving closer as if the lodge itself was alive. The temperature dropped suddenly, and they could see their breath misting in the air. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went quiet. The wind outside had stopped, and the fire crackled gently once more. The room, however, felt heavier. The group stood motionless, waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. But nothing came. Only the storm outside, and the unsettling sense that they weren't alone anymore. The unease settled over them like a blanket, thick and suffocating. What had been a peaceful night in the woods now felt like a trap. They had come to escape, but instead, they had walked straight into the heart of something far darker than they could have imagined. The night stretched on, but no one dared to sleep. The fire had regained some of its strength, crackling and popping in the hearth, but the warmth it provided was fleeting, as if the cold was creeping in from some place deeper than the forest outside. The group had gathered around the fire, their faces drawn tight with worry and fear. Sarah, who had been the first to venture toward the staircase, now sat at the edge of the room, her back to the cold, damp walls. Her fingers gripped her mug tightly, knuckles white. She didn't speak, didn't look at anyone. She simply stared into the flames, her mind clearly elsewhere. Mark, who had been the most skeptical of their growing unease, was no longer dismissive. He kept shifting in his seat, glancing toward the hallway every few seconds as if he expected something to emerge from the darkened passage. The others sat in a tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts, each trying to ignore the sound that seemed to be echoing through the walls. It wasn't tapping anymore. Now it was a soft, rhythmic thudding, as though something was beating against the timber, a slow, deliberate pattern that made their hearts race. "I think we need to leave," Sarah said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Her eyes were wide, fear reflected in them as she glanced up at the others. "There's something wrong here. We shouldn't have come." Sarah, calm down, Mark said, his voice low but firm. "It's just the wind or animals. We're overthinking this. You're tired. You're just hearing things." But even as he said the words, he didn't seem convinced, his eyes flicking nervously to the darkened hallway behind her. "I'm not hearing things, Mark," Sarah snapped, her voice rising. "Something's in the walls. We're not alone. Her words trailed off as she glanced toward the window, her gaze catching on something outside. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement in the trees, a shadow that lingered for just too long before vanishing. Her breath caught in her throat, and she leaned forward, her eyes wide and fearful. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing toward the window. The others, startled by her sudden change in tone, followed her gaze, but the storm had picked up again, obscuring the view. The trees outside swayed violently in the wind, their branches like twisted fingers reaching for the lodge. "It's just the storm," Mark said, though his voice had lost its confidence. The others remained silent, unwilling to voice their own suspicions. None of them spoke for a long while, the tension thick in the air, until the first sound came again. A soft, dragging scrape against the wooden walls, followed by a low groan, like something heavy shifting deep within the lodge's foundations. The room grew colder still, and despite the fire still burning in the hearth, their breath misted in the air. Each of them could feel it now, the pressure, the oppressive weight of something unseen watching from the shadows. "I'm going to check the windows," Mark said, standing up quickly and moving toward the old glass panes, his footsteps too loud in the quiet room. He yanked open the curtains, peering out into the night. For a brief moment, he saw nothing but the rain-swept trees and the flickering lights of the lodge's weak glow. But then he saw it, a figure just on the edge of the forest, standing still, unmoving. It was a man, or at least it looked like one, but there was something wrong with his posture. His limbs were too rigid, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Mark froze, his hand gripped tightly on the curtain as he stared out into the storm. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. "Mark?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence, her hand on his arm. He looked down at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. The man outside wasn't there anymore. "Mark, what's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark opened his mouth to speak but couldn't form the words. The wind howled again, and in the distance, the sound of something dragging across the ground reached their ears. A sharp, metallic scrape followed by a wet thud. Without a word, Sarah rushed toward him, her heart hammering in her chest. They had to leave. They had to get out of the lodge. But as they turned toward the door, the temperature in the room dropped even further, and a faint, almost imperceptible whisper reached their ears. It wasn't in the room, but outside, coming from somewhere in the forest, too far for them to understand, but close enough to make the hair on the back of their necks stand up. The whisper grew louder until it became a murmur, then a chant. Words that didn't make sense, but carried with them an undeniable sense of dread. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Mark could respond, the door to the hallway slammed shut with a deafening crash, shaking the walls. The entire lodge seemed to shudder. The group jumped, their hearts racing, but no one moved. "I think we should go," Sarah said again, her voice urgent. "Now." "I agree," Mark replied, his voice tight with fear. He moved to the door, but when he tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if something was blocking the way, holding the door shut from the other side. "What the hell?" he muttered, pulling harder on the door. The group gathered around him, each of them now visibly panicking. "Is there a back door?" Sarah asked, her breath shallow. "No," Mark replied, his voice strained. "There's only this one. We can't." He was cut off by the sound of footsteps from the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to come closer with each passing second. None of them dared to move. The footsteps grew louder, the sound of boots scraping against the wooden floor echoing through the lodge. No one spoke. No one even breathed. The group stood frozen, the only sound in the room the thudding of their own hearts. The fire had begun to wane again, its crackling diminished to a soft hiss, as if even the flames themselves were afraid. Mark's hand still gripped the door handle, his knuckles white. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any sign of a way out, but the lodge seemed to have transformed. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the shadows growing longer, more sinister. The steps were closer now, but they didn't sound like human feet. They were too slow, too deliberate, like something dragging itself through the house. Another crash from the hallway. The door to the basement was flung open, the old wood creaking on its hinges as though something, or someone, had just stepped into the room. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Suddenly the fire went out entirely. The room was plunged into darkness. Panic surged in their chests as they fumbled for something to light, but before anyone could move, the sound of breathing filled the room. Low, ragged, almost as if whatever it was in the hall was struggling for air, struggling to reach them. Then came a whisper, clear and unmistakable, as though someone had spoken directly into their ears. "You can't leave." The voice was harsh and rasping, full of malice and ancient hunger. Before anyone could react, the door to the lodge flew open and the cold rain poured in. And in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm, stood the figure of a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. The figure in the doorway stood unmoving, the storm raging behind it, the rain pouring down in sheets, but it didn't seem to touch the figure at all. It was as though the storm itself was held at bay, contained in some unnatural way. The man, if that's what he truly was tall and gaunt, his body twisted in an unnatural, inhuman way. His long, pale fingers curled at his sides, his dark clothes soaked from the storm, yet his face was untouched, his expression calm, even serene. His eyes, however, were anything but peaceful. They were hollow, deep voids where nothing but darkness seemed to swirl. His grin stretched wide, too wide, like it didn't belong to his face. The group stood frozen, unable to move or even speak. Mark's hand still gripped the door handle, his knuckles white with tension, but he couldn't bring himself to push it closed. Sarah's breath came in shallow gasps, her eyes wide, her body trembling as if she might fall at any moment. The others were just as still, just as paralyzed by the figure in the doorway. "Who are you?" Mark stammered, his voice barely more than a whisper. The figure didn't respond at first. Instead, he tilted his head, his hollow eyes scanning the room, as if examining each of them with a strange, predatory curiosity. The smile never left his face. Slowly, he took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under his weight. The sound was louder than it should have been, as though the very sound of his footsteps echoed from some place deep below the earth, like the building itself was groaning in response to his presence. "You should have never come," the figure rasped, his voice low and hollow like the wind through a graveyard. The sound of it seemed to send a chill through the room, deeper than the cold that had already settled in their bones. What do you want?" Sarah managed to ask, her voice quivering. The words felt foreign to her, as if she was speaking from someone else's body, but they slipped out nonetheless. Her heart was racing, her blood pounding in her ears, but still she couldn't look away from the man, or whatever he was, standing in the doorway. The figure smiled again, his grin widening impossibly, stretching to a point where his cheeks seemed to split open, exposing rows of teeth that were far too sharp, far too many. His eyes glowed faintly now, like two coals burning deep in his skull, and the air around him seemed to thicken, grow heavy, as if the world itself was pressing against them. "I want what is mine," he said, his voice soft, almost coaxing, but there was an unmistakable edge of menace in it. "And you are just where you need to be. I've been waiting, watching, calling." The word sent a shudder through each of them, and without thinking, Mark stepped backward, pushing the door harder in an attempt to close it. But it didn't budge. It was as if the door had become part of the wall, frozen in place by some invisible force. The figure didn't move to stop him. He merely stood there, watching, his dark eyes never leaving them. Why are you here?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. She didn't know where the courage had come from, but there was something in her that refused to back down. The man's presence, though terrifying, stirred something in her, a deep, primal instinct to survive. "I'm here because of you," he answered simply, his grin widening further. "Because of all of you. You've crossed the line. You've entered my domain." The storm outside picked up again, the wind howling as the figure took another slow, deliberate step forward. The temperature in the room dropped further, and the air thickened with an oppressive, suffocating weight. It was as if the very atmosphere was closing in on them, turning stale, choking them with the cold and the darkness. Sarah stepped forward, trying to steady her breath. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice more firm now. "We didn't mean to intrude. We just wanted to." But the figure cut her off with a low, guttural laugh. "Intruders? Oh, you think you were invited?" He chuckled darkly, his voice like gravel being scraped across stone. "You were never meant to leave." The door behind him slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls, cutting off their only means of escape. The fire in the hearth flared up violently, casting strange, contorted shadows across the walls, as though the flames themselves were reacting to the presence of the man in the doorway. What do you want from us?" Mark demanded, stepping forward with more courage than he felt. The others stood behind him, uncertain, but unwilling to leave him alone in this. "I've already told you," the figure replied softly, his smile never wavering. "You are where you belong. All of you. The forest has waited for you. It has called for you." "Forest? What are you talking about?" Sarah's voice shook with disbelief. "The forest," the figure repeated, his tone growing darker, more ominous. "The forest is me, and it has waited centuries for your return. The lodge is merely a gate, a threshold between your world and mine. You're not the first to come, but you will be the last." His words were like daggers, sinking into their minds, causing them to question everything they had ever known. The lodge was no ordinary place. The trees outside weren't just trees. The forest was something else entirely, something old, something ancient, and far more dangerous than they could have imagined. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered, her mind racing. "We didn't do anything. We just came here to escape." "Escape." The figure laughed again, a low, echoing sound that made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. "You think you came here to escape? You came because you belong here. You are part of the forest now, part of its hunger, its will." The ground beneath them seemed to tremble slightly, as if the earth itself was alive, reacting to the figure's words. The walls creaked, and the shadows deepened in the corners of the room. The fire in the hearth flickered wildly, its light now dancing erratically, casting strange, unnerving shapes across the room. One by one, each of them felt the weight of the figure's words sinking into their bones. The forest had been calling them. The lodge had been waiting for them. They weren't just lost travelers, they were part of something much darker, much older than they could ever have imagined. The man in the doorway wasn't just a ghost or a spirit. He was a harbinger, a keeper of an ancient force that had been lying in wait for them. The air seemed to hum with a quiet, vibrating energy, and the floor beneath them groaned as if it was shifting. "We have to leave. We have to get out of here," Mark whispered urgently, but his words sounded hollow, like they were being swallowed up by the room itself. He turned toward the door again, but it didn't move. The walls were closing in, the air thickening, as if the lodge itself was tightening its grip on them. "Leaving?" the figure repeated, his voice turning cold. "No one leaves once they've entered the forest. The forest never lets go." Suddenly, the fire went out again, leaving them in darkness. A soft, distant sound, like a whisper, began to rise in the air, just beyond their hearing. The walls seemed to pulse, as though the entire lodge was alive, its wooden beams groaning under some unseen weight. They were trapped. The forest had already claimed them. The darkness swallowed them whole. The fire, which had once offered a fleeting comfort, now felt like a distant memory, an illusion of warmth in a place that no longer made sense. The room was quiet except for the soft, rhythmic pulse that seemed to reverberate from the walls themselves. The whispers grew louder, yet they were still too faint to decipher. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. No, this sound was something else, a sound that came from deep within the lodge, within the earth, within the very trees surrounding them. The forest was speaking to them, reaching out with its unseen tendrils, pulling them closer, suffocating them with its presence. The figure in the doorway was gone, but its presence lingered, heavy in the air like the threat of an approaching storm. Sarah could still feel the weight of its gaze even though it was no longer visible. It was as if the forest itself was watching them now, every rustling leaf outside, every creak of the floor beneath them, every whisper in the dark. All of it was the forest's eyes and ears, waiting for them to make their next move. Mark fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking as he tried to turn on the flashlight. But the screen flickered, then went black. "What the hell?" he muttered, pressing the power button repeatedly, but there was no response. The storm outside raged louder, the wind howling like a pack of wolves closing in around them. The windows rattled in their frames, the panes trembling with the force of the wind, yet they remained shut, held in place by something far stronger than simple glass. "What is happening?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, as if speaking too loudly would break whatever fragile illusion of safety still clung to the lodge. She felt the walls closing in on them, a weight pressing down, threatening to crush them into the floor. "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice trembling now, "but we have to do something." A sudden bang sounded from the hallway, followed by the distinct sound of dragging, slow, deliberate, heavy. They all turned toward the sound, hearts pounding in their chests. But nothing appeared in the doorway. No figure, no shadow. Only the endless blackness of the hall stretching out like an abyss, pulling at them, whispering for them to enter. The pulse grew louder. It wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was in the floor beneath them, in the air, in their bones. The lodge itself was alive, a creature that had been waiting for something. Waiting for them. "I think we need to get out of here," Sarah said, her voice firm with a determination she didn't feel. She stood up, moving toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, the air around her seemed to thicken, as if something was pressing against her. The door didn't open. It didn't even budge. "We can't leave," Mark said quietly from behind her. "We're not allowed to leave." His words hit her like a slap, and she spun to face him, eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean we're not allowed to leave?" "The figure," Mark said, his voice trembling. "That man. He said we can't leave once we've come." A low, rumbling growl echoed through the walls, a sound that seemed to reverberate from deep within the earth, shaking the foundation of the lodge. It wasn't a growl from an animal, though. It was something far more primal, more ancient. It was the sound of something that had been slumbering for centuries, something that had just been awakened. The door behind them groaned, a long, drawn-out creak that sent a shiver down their spines. Slowly, the door swung open on its own, revealing the dark hallway once again. But this time it was different. The hallway was no longer just dark. It was shifting. The walls seemed to bend in ways that defied physics, the wood warping and twisting, the shadows moving like living things. "No," Sarah whispered, backing away from the door, her heart racing. "We can't go down there. It's not safe." "We have no choice," Mark replied, his voice hollow. "If we stay here, we'll be trapped. We have to face whatever this is." But Sarah wasn't sure they could face it. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of something that shouldn't exist. Whatever the forest had called them here for, it was more than they could handle. And yet, the pull to move forward was undeniable. The door beckoned them, the hallway seemed to promise answers, answers that they weren't sure they wanted to know. Reluctantly, Sarah turned to face the others, her eyes pleading for them to understand. "We have to stick together. No matter what happens." Mark nodded, though his expression was grim. "Stay close." With slow, deliberate steps, they moved toward the open door. The house groaned again, louder this time, as though it was urging them on. They entered the hallway, the temperature dropping significantly as they did, their breaths now visible in the cold air. The shadows stretched long, twisting unnaturally in the dim light. The faint, rhythmic thudding was still there, pulsing from deep within the walls, as though something was moving beneath the lodge. It was as if the forest had grown roots that had burrowed down through the floor, anchoring itself to the land and feeding off the life within it. As they moved deeper into the hallway, the walls began to change. The wooden beams warped, the plaster cracked and peeled away to reveal something else. Something ancient, something black and slick, like rotting flesh. The smell hit them then, sharp and rancid, filling their nostrils with the stench of decay. The further they moved, the worse it became, until the air was thick with the fetid odor, and it felt like it was choking them. "Are you seeing this?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "What's happening?" The hallway seemed to stretch before them, growing longer and longer, until they could no longer see the end. There was no light at the far side, just an endless, shifting expanse of darkness. The walls seemed to pulse now, the rhythmic thudding growing louder, more insistent. "I think we're not in the lodge anymore," Mark said, his voice low and uncertain. We've crossed over." "What?" Sarah gasped, but before she could ask more, the floor beneath them trembled, and with a horrible crack, the walls shifted violently. They stumbled, their bodies swaying as the ground beneath them buckled, groaning like the earth itself was tearing apart. The whispers grew louder, too loud now, filling their ears, their minds, until they couldn't tell where the sounds were coming from anymore. Were they coming from inside their heads, or was the forest speaking to them? The floor buckled again, and before they could react, the shadows seemed to move toward them, growing and shifting like black smoke, engulfing the hallway, reaching for them with cold, grasping hands. "No, no, no!" Sarah screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the sounds. The whispering, the thudding, the growling, all of it became one deafening roar that threatened to swallow them whole. With a final, bone-shaking shudder, the ground beneath them gave way entirely, and they fell. The fall was nothing like they expected. It wasn't like tumbling down a flight of stairs or losing their footing on a muddy path. It was more like being sucked into the very heart of the earth. The ground beneath them cracked open with a sound that seemed to come from deep within the bones of the world, and then, before they could even scream, they were falling. It wasn't just the fall that terrified them, it was the sensation of the ground giving way beneath them, as if the very lodge, the very forest itself, was swallowing them whole. Sarah's stomach dropped, her body weightless for a brief moment before the crushing pressure of falling slammed into her. The air rushed past her ears, the sound of wind deafening, and for a second she thought they might fall forever, lost in an endless void. But then, just as suddenly as the fall had begun, there was a sharp jolt, and she was thrown violently onto a hard surface. Her body hit the ground with a sickening thud, the breath knocked out of her as she landed on her side, gasping for air. She tried to push herself up, her hands scraping against the rough, uneven stone beneath her, but her body felt heavy, sluggish, as though the air itself was thick with some unseen weight. Her vision swam for a moment, the world spinning around her in dizzying circles. When she finally forced her eyes to focus, she saw Mark lying a few feet away, his face pale and contorted with pain. He groaned as he slowly pushed himself up, his hand clutching his head. "Are you okay?" Sarah managed to gasp, her voice hoarse. She forced herself to sit up, her muscles aching with the impact of the fall. Mark looked at her, blinking in confusion. His expression was distant, as if he were struggling to piece together what had just happened. I don't know. Where are we?" It wasn't until he spoke that Sarah fully realized where they had ended up. The fall had brought them into a vast cavern, its dark, jagged walls stretching high above them, disappearing into the darkness. The air was heavy, thick with the same musty, decaying smell that had filled the lodge before they fell. The ground was uneven, strewn with jagged rocks and thick vines that writhed like living things, their dark green tendrils creeping along the stone floor. "Where is everyone else?" Sarah asked, her heart racing as she scanned the cavern, her mind spinning with confusion. It had been so sudden, the fall, the way the ground had opened up beneath them. Mark turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with fear. They're gone," he said, his voice breaking. I don't see them." "No," Sarah whispered. She could feel a cold sweat beginning to form on the back of her neck. She scrambled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her as she looked frantically around the cavern. The air was so still, so oppressive, that it felt like it was pressing in on her, suffocating her. The darkness here was absolute, deeper than the blackness of the forest outside, and it stretched into every corner of the cavern, swallowing up the edges of the world. Where are we?" Sarah asked again, but her voice sounded smaller, quieter, as if the cavern itself had swallowed her words before they could reach her ears. She could feel it now, the presence of something ancient and malevolent, watching them from the depths of the cave. The same feeling they had gotten in the lodge, the same feeling of being hunted, being drawn into something beyond their understanding, was stronger here, more intense. The shadows that clung to the edges of the cavern seemed to shift and sway, like they were alive, moving toward them, closing in. A sudden rustling noise echoed in the distance, far off in the cavern's blackened recesses. It was the unmistakable sound of something dragging, something heavy scraping across the stone floor. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she turned toward Mark, her eyes wide with panic. "Did you hear that?" Mark's eyes were wide too, but he didn't respond. He was staring into the darkness, his face pale and drawn, his body stiff with fear. The dragging noise grew louder, closer, and Sarah could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. The sound was like a heartbeat, slow and methodical, the scraping of something moving with purpose toward them. It was then that she saw it, a dark shape emerging from the shadows at the far edge of the cavern, moving with a slow, deliberate pace. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, some shadow cast by the uneven stone. But no, there was something there, something that shouldn't be there, and it was coming toward them. A low, guttural growl resonated from the darkness, vibrating through the stone beneath her feet, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Mark," she whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "We need to move. Now." But Mark didn't react. He was frozen, staring at the shape in the shadows, his breath shallow and quick. It's not real," he muttered, his voice distant. "It can't be real." But Sarah knew better. The figure was real. It was massive, towering in the dark, its silhouette barely visible in the gloom, but she could see the shape of it now. A hulking creature covered in thick, matted fur, its head low and twisted like a nightmare brought to life. The growling grew louder, and the creature's eyes gleamed faintly in the darkness, two glowing orbs of pale yellow light that fixed on them with a hunger that made Sarah's stomach twist. "Mark!" she screamed, shaking him violently, but his body didn't respond. He was still locked in place, staring into the abyss, his eyes wide with terror. The creature stepped forward, its massive claws scraping against the stone floor, each movement deliberate, each step closer to them. The shadows seemed to follow it, twisting and curling around it like the tendrils of some ancient force, as though the darkness itself was part of the creature, feeding off it, protecting it. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Mark by the arm and yanked him toward her. "We need to run," she cried, her voice desperate. But before she could turn to flee, the growl deepened, the creature's jaws parting with an eerie, bone-chilling sound. Its teeth were long and jagged like the fangs of some ancient predator, and its mouth was dripping with something dark, something foul. It took another step forward, and the ground beneath them trembled, as if the very earth was shuddering in fear. "Sarah," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible now. It's coming." The cavern seemed to close in on them, the shadows pressing in on every side. The air grew thick, suffocating, and Sarah could feel the weight of the creature's gaze, the heaviness of its presence bearing down on her like an unbearable pressure. The whispering had returned, too, louder now, echoing in her mind, calling her, beckoning her to come closer, to step into the darkness. The creature growled again, a deafening sound that vibrated through the stone floor and made the walls themselves tremble. With a scream, Sarah yanked Mark toward her, pulling him toward the nearest exit, if there was one. But before they could move, the ground shook violently, and the cavern seemed to split open. A dark, gaping maw appeared before them, like the mouth of some enormous beast, waiting to swallow them whole. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, and in that instant, the world seemed to collapse in on itself. The darkness exploded forward, pulling them toward the edge of the abyss. They were falling again, but this time there was no end in sight, no floor to catch them. Just an endless, crushing void. It wasn't like falling through air anymore. It was as though they were plummeting into a sea of darkness, a void that stretched on for eternity. Sarah's stomach lurched with the sensation of weightlessness, the world around her twisting and contorting in a dizzying spiral. The walls of the cavern, the growling creature, even Mark. Everything disappeared as though it had never existed. The silence was all-encompassing, but even more unsettling was the feeling that they weren't alone. There was something else down here, something deeper, something older than the darkness itself. It wrapped around them like a shroud, suffocating and all-consuming, until even the sensation of falling seemed to fade away. Then, suddenly, with a deafening crack, the void gave way. The ground beneath them slammed into existence once more. Sarah's body collided with the cold, hard stone, the impact so violent it left her breathless. For a moment she couldn't move. She lay there, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the nothingness above her, the air thick with the taste of metal and decay. Her body screamed in protest as she tried to push herself up, every muscle aching, every nerve on fire. She could hear her pulse in her ears, the pounding in her chest almost too loud to bear. Slowly, her vision began to focus, and she saw the faintest flicker of movement in the dark, shadows creeping around the edges of her sight. "Mark," she gasped, her voice weak. "Mark, where are you?" She couldn't see him at first. She couldn't see anything but darkness, solid, oppressive, unyielding. The air felt thick and suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel something breathing near her, its presence heavy, like it was lurking just beyond her reach. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, a cold shiver running down her spine. She tried to sit up, but her limbs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. Her head spun with dizziness and she had to fight to stay conscious. A groan broke the silence. It was Mark. She could barely make out his form in the darkness, but he was there, crumpled on the stone floor a few feet away, his body unmoving. Panic surged through her, and she pushed herself to her feet, her knees buckling beneath her as she stumbled toward him. Her hands shook as she reached for him, trying to turn him over, but when she touched his shoulder, it was ice cold, like he was made of stone. "Mark?" she whispered, her throat tight with fear. He didn't respond. There was no movement from him at all. His body lay limp and unfeeling, his eyes half open, staring into the darkness with a blank, vacant expression. She shook him harder, her breath ragged now, panic clawing at the edges of her mind. "Mark, wake up. Please wake up." But then, in the flickering dimness of the shadows around them, something moved. At first, it was just a rustle, a shifting of air too subtle to catch with her eyes. But then, as if drawn by some unseen force, the shadows began to take shape. Slowly, the darkness seemed to coalesce, to form into a mass of moving tendrils, curling and twisting like snakes, creeping along the ground toward them. The shadows weren't just shadows. They were alive, and they were reaching out, crawling toward them with a hunger that made Sarah's blood run cold. Her pulse hammered in her chest as she dragged Mark away, trying to pull him with her, but it felt like he was dead weight. She couldn't get him to move. She could feel the cold, suffocating darkness pressing against her, and every instinct told her to run, to escape, but the shadows were already surrounding them. They were too close now. They were everywhere. A soft, hollow laugh echoed from the darkness. It was low, guttural, like a mocking whisper that made her skin crawl. The sound was so distant, so impossibly far away, and yet it felt like it was inside her head. It wasn't just the shadows that were alive, it was the very air, the ground beneath her, the cavern itself. Everything in this place was alive, watching, waiting. Then, from the heart of the darkness, she saw it. It was a shape, barely distinguishable from the shadows around it, but it moved with purpose, its form shifting and contorting as if it didn't belong in this world. The outline of a tall figure became clearer. No, it wasn't just one figure. It was hundreds of them, stacked upon each other, their bodies overlapping, their limbs twisted in unnatural ways. Their faces were a blur, like someone had taken 1,000 faces and melded them into one grotesque visage. The figure reached out, a hand stretching from the darkness, fingers elongated, skeletal, and covered in patches of dark, decaying skin. It didn't speak, but the presence of it, this thing, was enough to freeze her in place. The air around her grew colder, more oppressive, like a weight pressing down on her chest. The thing was too close. It was far too close. "Sarah," a voice rasped, one that wasn't Mark's. It came from somewhere deep within the mass of darkness. It was guttural, ancient, the voice of something that had not spoken in 1,000 years. "You've come to claim what was never yours." The voice seemed to pulse through her, each word a hammer blow to her mind. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She could only stare at the creature, its hollow eyes gleaming with malice as it loomed closer. "This place is not for you," the voice whispered, its breath hot and foul in her ear. "You were never meant to leave." The shadows crept closer, the mass of bodies shifting and writhing as they closed in on her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, the pull of their hunger, and for the first time in her life she felt truly and utterly small, insignificant. They were not human. They were not even alive in the way she understood it. They were something else, something older than the earth itself. The thing in front of her, a tangle of writhing shapes, faces, and limbs, reached out again, this time with a sense of urgency, as if it could sense her fear, feel the trembling in her body. It was only inches away now. She could smell the rot that clung to it, feel the coldness seep through her skin as if the thing itself was draining her warmth, her energy. Then, just as its hand reached toward her, Mark moved. His body jerked, and his eyes snapped open, wide and wild, but they were no longer the same. There was something different about him, something inhuman. His pupils were no longer human. They were black, soulless voids, and his skin seemed pale, almost translucent. He didn't speak, didn't react in the way Sarah expected. Instead, his lips parted in a grotesque grin that didn't belong on his face. "Sarah?" he said, but the voice that came from him wasn't his. It was hollow, guttural, distorted, like 1,000 voices trapped inside one body. "You've come to join us." "No," she gasped, stumbling back, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows had surrounded her completely, and the creature, no, they were closing in from all sides. "Mark, please fight it. Don't." But it was too late. Mark's grin stretched even further, his eyes glowing with the same eerie, unnatural light as the creature's, and before Sarah could react, he lunged. The darkness seemed to swallow them both, pulling her into its cold embrace. The last thing she saw before everything went black was his outstretched hand, his face twisted in a grotesque mockery of his former self, and the endless abyss that awaited them. The darkness enveloped her completely, suffocating every thought, every breath. It was as though she were submerged in some inescapable black sea, the pressure of the weightless void pushing down on her chest, forcing the air from her lungs. The last coherent thought Sarah had before the shadows swallowed her whole was that she had failed. She had failed to escape, to save Mark, to understand what was happening. And now she was just another part of this nightmare, another victim to be consumed by whatever ancient, monstrous force controlled this place. But then the void shifted. At first it was just a flicker, a strange, almost imperceptible tremor in the abyss, a pulse of light in the distance. She thought she was imagining it, but the light grew brighter, more intense, until it was the only thing in the universe, consuming everything in its path. And then, with a rush that sent her spinning, she was pulled toward it, her body weightless again, but this time the sensation wasn't terrifying. It felt like release, like the shadows themselves had relinquished their grip, had finally allowed her to escape. But as she reached the light, it shifted again, suddenly, sharply, like the universe was shifting in its very fabric. And with a violent lurch, the light snapped back into the darkness, disappearing into the void. Sarah screamed. The sound was raw, torn from her throat, as if the very act of trying to express her fear was tearing her apart. But the scream was swallowed by the darkness, and she was falling again. This time there was no weightlessness. There was no strange freedom of floating. Instead, it felt as though she was being pulled downward, into the very core of the earth itself. She was plummeting into something far darker, far deeper. And it wasn't the shadows that frightened her now. It was the emptiness. The sensation was unlike anything she had ever felt. There was no sound, nothing but the thick silence pressing in on her, no wind to ruffle her hair, no sense of direction. It was as though she were falling into a chasm that didn't just stretch through space, but through time itself. How long had she been falling? How far had she gone? Could have been seconds or centuries. She didn't know. Then, as abruptly as it began, the fall stopped. It wasn't a gentle landing. No, it was a violent jolt, a shock to her entire body, like hitting the ground at terminal velocity and being forced to stop by an invisible wall. She gasped, her breath torn from her chest as the impact rattled her bones. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Her head spun, a foggy cloud of confusion and pain. And then, as the disorientation faded, she became aware of her surroundings. Sarah's eyes snapped open, blinking rapidly, her hands pressing against the cold, damp stone beneath her. She gasped for air, her chest heaving as she fought to steady herself. The place she found herself in was nothing like the cavern from before, nothing like the lodge. This place was ancient. There was no other word for it. The walls were covered in strange markings, jagged, crisscrossing patterns carved deep into the stone. Some were familiar. Some seemed almost human, but most were alien, otherworldly, symbols that seemed to writhe and move just beyond her comprehension. The air was thick, almost suffocating, as if the very atmosphere held secrets in its depths, secrets that were better left undiscovered. The ground beneath her feet was rough and uneven, filled with craggy stone outcroppings and patches of what appeared to be moss, though it glowed faintly an eerie pale green. Sarah's fingers brushed against it, and a sudden electric jolt ran up her spine, like the moss was alive. The ground itself seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy, a force that she could feel in her bones. It was as though the entire place was a living organism, breathing with a mind of its own. She forced herself to stand, her legs unsteady beneath her, and looked around. The place stretched out in all directions, an endless, twisting labyrinth of tunnels and chambers. The air smelled of ancient dust and decay, like an underground tomb, and yet, it wasn't completely dead. There was a sense of presence here, something old, something that had been waiting for a long time. "Mark," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she looked around. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, her breath shallow as she took in her surroundings. Where had he gone? Had he fallen with her? Was he still himself? The darkness that had swallowed them was still there, in the corners of her vision. It was like a creeping fog, always just on the edge of her sight, but when she turned her head, there was nothing. Only the labyrinth stretching out before her. She couldn't just stand there. She had to move. She had to find out where she was, find Mark, find some way out of this nightmare. With tentative steps, Sarah moved forward, her senses heightened, every nerve on edge. She kept expecting something, someone, to leap out of the shadows, to drag her back into the darkness, but nothing came. The further she went, the deeper the tunnel seemed to stretch. The walls seemed to close in on her with each step, the markings more numerous, more oppressive, the further she walked. And then she heard it. A soft sound, barely perceptible at first, but unmistakable, a faint, rhythmic tapping like someone or something was walking ahead of her. Her pulse quickened and she froze, her heart in her throat. She wasn't alone. There was someone else here. The sound grew louder, closer, and she began to move toward it, cautiously, not daring to make a sound herself. Her breath caught as she reached the edge of a large chamber, its ceiling lost in the shadows above, the walls lined with ancient stone carvings that twisted and turned like something alive. And in the center of the room stood a figure. Mark. At least it looked like Mark. But this wasn't the Mark she knew. His face was pale, almost ashen, his eyes wide and blank. There was no recognition in them, no spark of the man she had known. His body was rigid, as if he was frozen in place, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His lips were moving, but the words didn't make sense. They weren't words at all. They were more like a chant, a low, guttural hum that reverberated through the stone. Sarah's throat went dry, her heart pounding in her chest as she stepped forward. "Mark?" she whispered. Her voice felt alien in the oppressive silence of the chamber. At the sound of her voice, Mark's head snapped toward her. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a fleeting moment she thought she saw a flicker of recognition. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something darker, something more terrifying. His lips curled into a twisted smile, and he spoke, but his voice was no longer his own. It was deep, layered with hundreds of voices speaking in unison, each one more distorted than the last. "You should not have come back," the voice said, its tone chilling, hollow. "You are too late. The forest has claimed you. There is no escape." Suddenly, the room around her shifted. The walls, the ceiling, the very air itself began to warp and twist, and the world seemed to tilt as if reality itself was coming undone. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet, and before she could react, the chamber erupted into an overwhelming cacophony of whispers. The walls bled shadows, and the carvings on the stone seemed to come to life, their twisted shapes reaching out toward her. "No!" she screamed, stumbling backward. But it was too late. The shadows closed in, the whispering growing louder, and Mark's form began to flicker, becoming more and more distorted with each passing second. "Run!" Mark's voice rasped, but it wasn't a warning. It was a command, an order. And then, before Sarah could react, she felt something grab her, cold hands wrapping around her body, pulling her into the darkness. The hands that grabbed her were cold, so cold it felt like they were freezing her very soul. They were not hands in the traditional sense. There were too many of them, far too many, and they were not flesh. They were something more primal, more ancient, skeletal, made of sinew and shadow. They wrapped around her with a suffocating grip, pulling her deeper into the labyrinthine darkness. She screamed, but the sound was lost to the oppressive atmosphere of the cavern, swallowed up by the walls that seemed to close in tighter with every second. Her body jerked as she was dragged forward, her feet slipping on the slick stone beneath her. The ground was uneven, jagged, filled with sharp, broken rock that seemed to reach out for her as if the very earth itself was alive, desperate to claim her. Her hands scrambled to find purchase, but there was nothing to hold on to, just the cold, damp walls and the ever-growing weight of the darkness pressing in on her. "Mark!" she gasped, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Her heart pounded in her chest, blood rushing in her ears as she twisted in the cold grasp, trying desperately to break free. But the hands only tightened, their grip unyielding. She felt as if she were being pulled apart by an unseen force, her body torn between the desire to escape and the overwhelming pull of the darkness. The shadows swirled around her, and for a moment she thought she saw something flicker at the edges of her vision. Faces, twisted and contorted, their eyes hollow and empty, staring at her with an unblinking intensity. They weren't human. They were something else. Something far older, far more terrifying than anything she could have ever imagined. They whispered, their voices a mix of anguish and hunger, 1,000 voices merging into one in a cacophony of despair. "No!" Sarah gasped, her mind reeling. "This can't be real. This can't be happening." But it was real. The coldness, the shadows, the endless pull of the darkness. All of it was real, and there was no escape. The hands continued to drag her forward, deeper into the labyrinth. She didn't know how long they had been moving. Time had no meaning here. The air was thick with a strange, intoxicating energy that made her feel dizzy, disoriented. Each step she took felt heavier, as though the very weight of the world was pressing down on her. Every breath was a struggle, and the closer she got to the heart of this place, the more she felt like she was being consumed by it, devoured by its hunger. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of being dragged through the cold, twisting tunnels, they came to a stop. The hands released their grip, and Sarah collapsed to the ground, her knees hitting the rough stone with a sharp crack. She gasped for air, her chest heaving with exhaustion, but the moment she opened her mouth to speak, the air around her seemed to grow heavier, thicker. It became harder to breathe, as though the very atmosphere was becoming a living entity, pressing in on her from all sides. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her, and looked around. The walls were covered in more markings, more symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie glow. They twisted and moved as though they were alive, changing shape as if they had a mind of their own. It was like nothing she had ever seen, and the longer she stared at them, the more they seemed to pull her in, to draw her deeper into their hypnotic patterns. At the center of the chamber there was something large, massive. It was obscured by shadows, but she could feel it. A presence, ancient and malevolent, like a dark force that had been lying in wait for eons. It wasn't the stone, the walls, or the shadows that made the air feel so thick with dread. It was this thing. Whatever it was the heart of this place, and it was watching her. Her pulse quickened as she took a cautious step forward, her heart racing in her chest. She felt an overwhelming urge to run, to turn and flee, but something inside her, something deep and primal, kept her rooted to the spot. It was as if the very essence of the place was calling to her, beckoning her toward it, pulling her into its depths. Slowly, she stepped closer, each footfall echoing through the cavern like a drumbeat. The air grew colder with each step, and the presence before her grew stronger, more suffocating. She could feel it now, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her like a physical force, its eyes locked onto her as if it were waiting for something, waiting for her to take the final step. And then, as if on cue, the shadows around her seemed to pull back, retreating into the corners of the room, revealing the thing at the center. It was a figure, but not one she could fully comprehend. It was humanoid, but distorted. Its body was made of the same shifting, dark substance that had formed the shadows, its form flickering like a flame in the wind. Its face was obscured, hidden behind a mask of swirling darkness, but the eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two bright, burning orbs of red, glowing in the inky blackness of its face. For a moment, Sarah couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The figure stood there, unmoving, its presence overwhelming, like the very embodiment of the darkness that surrounded her. It wasn't just a creature, it was an existence, a force of nature, something beyond the realm of comprehension. Its form seemed to shift with the ebb and flow of the shadows, its limbs stretching and contorting in unnatural ways. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and Sarah fell to her knees, her hands bracing against the cold stone as the air grew thick with an indescribable pressure. The figure in front of her lifted one long, twisted arm, extending a hand toward her. Its fingers, long and skeletal, twisted like tree branches, and she felt the overwhelming urge to step forward, to reach out to it. "No," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I won't." But it was as though the words had no power here. The darkness around her seemed to swallow her voice, and she was left with nothing but the pounding of her heart in her ears. The figure's hand came closer, its fingers inching toward her face, and Sarah could feel the coldness of its presence, its touch, even before it reached her. The shadows themselves seemed to bend and move with it, as if it were an extension of the very fabric of this world. And then, just as its fingers brushed against her skin, the world exploded in a rush of sound and light. The ground beneath her cracked open again, splitting wide, and she screamed as she was thrown backward, tumbling through the air, her body spinning in an uncontrollable spiral. The shadows around her twisted and shrieked, the very walls of the cavern shifting and bending like they were alive, and Sarah felt herself being torn apart, pulled in every direction at once. The world around her was nothing but chaos, a violent storm of darkness and light, of time and space unraveling in every direction. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air was thick with pressure, her body feeling like it was being crushed from all sides. Her limbs twisted unnaturally, her spine snapping under the weight of the force, and she knew that she was going to die here in this place of ancient darkness, with no one to hear her final breath. But then, in the midst of the chaos, she felt it, something pulling her back. It was gentle at first, like a soft whisper in the darkness, but it grew stronger with each passing second, a tug at her core as if something was reaching out to her, guiding her. The shadows began to pull away, retreating back into the corners of her vision, and the pressure on her chest began to ease. Her body, which had felt so heavy, so broken, suddenly felt lighter, like it was being released from some unseen grip. And then, before she could understand what was happening, there was a flash of light, blinding, pure, and all-encompassing. The flash of light was overwhelming, so bright that it seared through the darkness like a bolt of pure energy, cutting through the suffocating void that had held her captive. It was like nothing she had ever experienced, an all-consuming light that filled every inch of her vision, every corner of her mind. It was not warm, not comforting, but sharp, as if it was peeling away the layers of her reality, exposing the raw essence of everything around her. For a moment, Sarah felt as though she had been completely obliterated, her very being reduced to nothing. The sensation was like being torn apart at the molecular level, scattered to the winds of some cosmic storm. But then, just as suddenly as the light had appeared, it faded. And she was left, once again, in the suffocating darkness, but something was different. Her body felt whole again. The crushing weight that had pinned her down was gone. The oppressive pressure that had threatened to collapse her chest had lifted. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe freely, without the weight of something ancient, something hungry, pressing down on her. But that wasn't the only thing that was different. There was a presence. Not the same malevolent force that had haunted her every step, not the same dark figure that had reached for her, but something else. Something gentle, yet undeniably powerful. It was as if the very air around her had shifted, infused with something ancient, something protective. It wasn't the oppressive force of the darkness. It was a kind of calm, a steady pulse that filled the silence with a sense of stillness and understanding. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, though she hadn't realized they had closed. The world around her was no longer the twisting, chaotic labyrinth that had tried to tear her apart. Instead, she found herself standing in a vast expanse of soft, golden light, the ground beneath her feet solid but comforting, like she was standing on a bed of moss in an ancient forest. The air smelled different here, cleaner, fresher, like rain on earth, the fragrance of old wood and fresh pine. The shadows, which had once been her constant companion, now seemed distant, faded away into the background, no longer a threat. The light that surrounded her was soft, warm, like the dawn breaking through a thick morning mist, but it wasn't blinding anymore. It was welcoming, embracing. She looked around, disoriented, but also strangely calm. The feeling that had been tormenting her, that gnawing sensation of being hunted, of being drawn into something she couldn't escape, had dissipated. It was replaced by a sense of stillness, a deep, ancient stillness that filled every part of her. It was a sense of quiet, of peace, but it also held something more profound, something older. And then, as her eyes adjusted to the light, she saw it. The figure. It stood before her, though it had not appeared out of thin air. It had always been there, waiting for her to notice. At first, it seemed like a mere silhouette against the golden light, but as she stepped closer, its form came into focus, more solid, more defined. It was humanoid, but not entirely. The figure was tall, draped in flowing robes that seemed to shimmer with an ethereal glow, as if they were woven from the light itself. The robes rippled like water, changing colors as they moved, shifting from pale gold to deep emerald to violet and then back to gold, the fabric itself alive with energy. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, shadowed and hidden, but the presence it exuded was one of wisdom, power, and serenity. It radiated an ancient energy, as if it had been alive before time itself had begun. The figure did not speak, but it didn't need to. The presence alone was enough. It was as though it was communicating with her on a level beyond words, beyond language. Sarah felt it in her chest, in the core of her being. The message was clear. You are not alone. You have not been forgotten. The silence stretched on, but it was not uncomfortable. It was profound, pregnant with meaning, as if the figure was waiting for her to understand something, waiting for her to come to terms with what had happened, with what was happening now. Am I dead? Sarah finally asked, her voice shaking despite herself, the question that had been tormenting her since she had fallen into the abyss, since the shadows had dragged her into that terrible cavern. The figure remained still for a moment, and then, slowly, it raised its arm, a graceful motion like the unfolding of a flower. With a sweeping gesture, it gestured to the space around them, the golden light, the calm expanse of nothingness. This is not death. The figure's voice resonated in her mind, a deep, melodic tone that seemed to echo across the very fabric of existence. This is the space between. The threshold. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The threshold? The meaning of those words sent a shiver through her. The threshold between what? She whispered, but her voice felt small in the presence of this figure. The figure did not answer directly, but instead motioned again, and as it did, the light around her shifted. It deepened, swirling, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to ripple, as if the very earth itself was alive. She stepped back instinctively, but the figure's presence held her in place, stilling her trembling body. The light parted, revealing something beneath it. A tree. A massive tree, its trunk gnarled and ancient, its roots stretching deep into the earth, its branches high above, lost in the golden mist. Its bark was dark, almost black, and etched with strange runes, glowing faintly with a soft, pulsing light. The tree seemed to hum with life, as if it were the very heart of this place, a center of power, of knowledge, of life itself. And Sarah understood in that moment that the tree was alive. It wasn't just a tree, it was a being, a presence that stretched across realms, across time. "Is this where I am?" she whispered, her heart racing as she took in the sight before her. The tree seemed to reach toward her, its branches like arms, welcoming, offering solace, understanding. "Is this the threshold?" "Yes," the figure answered, its voice like wind through the leaves, distant and near at once. "This is the threshold of all things. The place where the lost souls wander. The place where time does not pass in the way you know it. Where the living and the dead meet. And where the truth is revealed." Sarah felt the weight of its words, felt the truth sinking into her bones, deep into her heart. She had been lost. She had wandered this place, pulled into its depths, trying to escape something she didn't understand, something that had been waiting for her, following her. But now she was here, standing before the threshold, standing before the ancient tree, the center of all things, the heart of the universe. The figure turned toward the tree, and Sarah followed its gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She understood then. She understood what had drawn her here, what had brought her to this place. It wasn't just the darkness, the shadows, the figures that had haunted her every step. It was the truth that had been hidden from her, buried deep beneath the surface of her reality. "You have crossed the threshold," the figure said, its voice resonating like the ringing of a bell. "And now you must choose. Will you return to the world you know, or will you stay here, where time does not move, where all things are possible but nothing is certain?" Sarah's mind reeled with the enormity of the choice, the gravity of the decision laid bare before her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She knew that whatever happened next, whatever choice she made, she wasn't alone. The tree, the figure, it was all part of this place, part of this ancient power, and she had been brought here for a reason. And she would make her choice. The golden light that had enveloped Sarah seemed to pulse with life as she stood before the towering tree, her heart still hammering in her chest. Her mind felt stretched to its limits, each thought spinning like 1,000 winds, each one tugging her in a different direction. She had come to this place in search of escape, in search of answers, but now that she was here, standing at the threshold of everything, the weight of her decision felt heavier than anything she could have imagined. The figure, still silent and serene, stood beside her, its presence both comforting and overwhelming. The air around her shimmered with a quiet power, a force that hummed in her veins, in the very air she breathed. The figure's face remained hidden beneath the hood, but Sarah could feel its gaze, steady and unwavering, like it was waiting for her to understand something deep within herself. The tree loomed ahead of her, its gnarled branches reaching upward toward an unseen sky, its roots twisting into the earth like ancient veins, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. The runes etched into its bark seemed to shift with each passing moment, their glow intensifying as if responding to the very heartbeat of the world itself. The question the figure had posed echoed in Sarah's mind like a chant. Will you return to the world you know, or will you stay here, where time does not move, where all things are possible, but nothing is certain? The choice was too much for her to bear alone, too heavy to carry without understanding. She didn't know what lay ahead in either path, didn't know what consequences would follow. Returning to her world meant facing the terror, the uncertainty, the pain she had left behind, the horrors of the lodge, the shadows that had pursued her, the creatures that had wanted to claim her. It meant facing Mark, if he was even still Mark, and confronting whatever had twisted him in this place. But staying here, in this place between worlds, was no guarantee of safety either. It was a realm outside time, a space where nothing was certain, a place where she might lose herself forever. She glanced at the figure beside her, its form still immobile, its silence profound. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of her own breath, shallow and uncertain, echoing in the space around them. Then, without thinking, she took a step forward, closer to the tree, her hand reaching out toward the smooth, dark bark. The moment her fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy shot through her, so powerful it left her gasping. It was as though the tree itself was alive, pulsing with the life of an entire universe, each beat of its energy sending ripples through the very air around her. The runes etched into its bark flared to life, glowing with an intensity that seemed to drown out everything else. Sarah felt the truth, the truth, flooding into her mind, a rush of images, sensations, and emotions too vast to comprehend. She saw the forest, but it was not the same forest she had wandered through. This was a place older than time, where the trees were ancient beyond measure, their roots reaching deep into the heart of the earth. She saw the faces of countless beings, some human, some not, each one marked with an expression of longing, of searching, of loss. They moved in the shadows, trapped in the space between life and death, between the worlds that existed beyond their understanding. And then she saw herself. Her own face, her own body, as though she were a stranger, a different version of herself, one who had walked through these same paths long ago, and who had come to the same crossroads. She saw the moments of her life, the choices she had made, the paths she had taken, and the paths she had not. She saw her fear, her doubt, her uncertainty, and the way those feelings had shaped her, had led her here to this very moment. The images faded as quickly as they had come, and Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. She could feel the weight of the tree's power still pulsing through her, lingering in her veins, like the echo of a memory too ancient to fully grasp. She looked down at her hand, which still rested lightly on the tree's bark, and realized that she had been marked by it. The runes that had once only glowed faintly now seemed to pulse with a life of their own, and she could feel their energy, their meaning, deep within her. She turned toward the figure, her voice shaking as she finally spoke. "What is this place?" she whispered. "What does it want from me?" The figure remained silent, its hood still drawn, but the air around Sarah seemed to respond to her words. The trees around her shuddered, their branches swaying with an unseen breeze, their leaves rustling like whispers in the dark. The golden light that surrounded her flickered and shifted, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward her, wrapping around her like the tendrils of a dream. The figure lifted its arms slowly, motioning toward the tree as it spoke, not with words, but with a presence that resonated deep within her mind. "You have crossed the threshold, Sarah," the voice reverberated. "This is not just a place. It is a moment, a point where all paths converge. The place where the past and future meet, where decisions are made, where time collapses. You have walked the path of the lost, and now you stand at the center of everything. The choice is yours, but remember, to choose is to become. What you decide here will shape everything to come." Sarah felt the weight of those words settle over her like a blanket, heavy and suffocating. The implications of her decision felt like 1,000 invisible threads pulling at her, each one a different path, a different outcome, all of them leading to some unknown end. She wanted to turn away, to run from the enormity of it all, but there was nowhere to run. She glanced at the tree again, and this time she felt something new, something unfamiliar. There was a connection, a bond between her and the tree, as though they were one and the same. It was more than just the runes, more than the energy that had flowed through her. It was her. She felt the echoes of her own life stretching out before her, the choices she had made, the paths she had walked, and in that moment she understood. She had not been brought here by chance. She had been brought here by herself. This place, this threshold, it was not just some otherworldly dimension. It was a reflection of her own soul, her own journey, her own fears and desires. The forest, the shadows, the figures, everything had been a mirror of herself, a reflection of the parts of her that she had yet to understand. And now she had to decide who she would become. The decision was hers to make, but it was not an easy one. Returning to her old world meant facing the horrors that awaited her, the memories, the shadows, the creatures that had hunted her. It meant confronting the man who had once been Mark, but was now something else entirely, something twisted by the same forces that had dragged her into this place. But staying here, in this space between worlds, meant a kind of peace, a peace that came with a cost. It meant leaving behind everything she had known, cutting herself off from the world of the living, the world of time and change. It meant surrendering herself to a realm where nothing was certain, where nothing was fixed, where the rules of existence no longer applied. She closed her eyes, her breath shaky, and for the first time she felt a flicker of understanding. She didn't have to know what would happen next. She didn't have to understand the path that lay ahead. What mattered was that she chose. She would not let the darkness choose for her. She would not let the shadows pull her into a life she could not control. With a final, steadying breath, Sarah lifted her hand from the tree's bark and turned to face the figure. The golden light around her seemed to brighten, as if in response to her decision. She was ready now. "I choose," she said, her voice clear and strong. The figure nodded, and in that single, simple gesture, Sarah knew that whatever choice she made would be hers, and hers alone. The path ahead would be uncertain, but it would be hers to walk. The golden light swirled around her, and the tree's branches creaked, as though the very world itself was holding its breath. Time itself seemed to pause, waiting for her next move. The golden light flickered and hummed, alive with an energy Sarah could feel deep in her bones. It was as if the entire world, this world, was holding its breath, waiting for her decision. The ancient tree, its gnarled roots twisting into the earth, seemed to pulse with an unseen heartbeat. The runes on its bark were now glowing brighter than ever, their symbols shifting and rearranging, as if alive with meaning that only Sarah could begin to comprehend. For a long moment, everything was still. The air around her hummed with a quiet vibration, a steady pulse that reverberated through her body, through the very space itself. The figure beside her remained motionless, its presence silent but somehow reassuring. It was like the calm before a storm, the silence before a great change, and in that silence, Sarah felt herself becoming aware of something new, a deeper understanding of herself and the choices that lay ahead. "I choose," she repeated softly, her voice gaining strength with each word, as if the very act of saying it was unlocking something within her. "I choose to face what comes. I choose to fight for what's left of me, for what's left of this world." The figure beside her did not move, but Sarah could feel it. Its approval, its acceptance, an energy that filled the space like a warm breeze. There was no judgment here, no condemnation. It was simply the understanding that this was her path to take. The golden light that surrounded them grew even brighter, its intensity almost overwhelming, but Sarah didn't look away. She embraced it, letting it wash over her, letting it fill her with its strange and powerful energy. The moment she spoke those words, "I choose," the world around her seemed to shift. The golden light began to twist and warp, spiraling upwards like a great column of fire. The air hummed louder now, a soft, vibrating sound that made her teeth ache. The ground beneath her feet trembled, as though the earth itself was responding to her decision. And then, with a suddenness that stole her breath away, the column of light shot into the sky, a blazing beam that pierced the fabric of the world itself, ripping through the veil of reality. Sarah staggered backward, instinctively reaching out for something to hold onto, but there was nothing to steady her. The world was shifting beneath her feet, the golden light stretching and bending in ways that defied understanding. The air around her pulsed, alive with energy, as if every molecule was vibrating in unison, caught in the thrall of something greater than them all. The sound of the light was deafening now, a high-pitched hum that filled the air like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. It was not painful, but it was intense, an overwhelming sensation that shook her to her core. She gasped, her breath coming in shallow bursts as she tried to understand what was happening. The space around her seemed to fold and stretch, like a sheet of fabric being pulled in different directions. The tree, the golden light, the figure, they were all becoming distorted, melting into the very fabric of the world itself. The boundaries between what was real and what was illusion blurred, and Sarah felt herself being drawn into the center of it all. She could feel herself being pulled upward, her body weightless, as if gravity itself had lost all meaning. And then, in a single, overwhelming instant, everything stopped. The light flickered one final time, its brilliance blinding for a brief moment, before it faded into nothingness. The hum, the vibration, the overwhelming sense of power, all of it disappeared, leaving Sarah standing in a place that was unlike anything she had ever known. She was no longer in the golden realm, no longer standing before the ancient tree or the figure. Instead, she found herself standing on a wide, open plain under a sky that stretched endlessly above her, a sky that was both light and dark at the same time, as if the day and night were fighting for dominance. The air was still, unnaturally so, and the ground beneath her feet felt soft, like the earth itself was alive. The grasses around her were tall, swaying in an unseen breeze that felt like it came from the very heart of the land. It was peaceful here, too peaceful. There was no sign of the shadows, no trace of the darkness that had once pursued her. Everything was still, as if time itself had paused. She looked around, trying to make sense of her new surroundings, but there was no answer. The plain stretched out in all directions, a vast expanse of nothingness broken only by the occasional tree or distant mountain range. There was no sign of civilization, no sign of life, other than the quiet rustle of the wind through the grass. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, her voice almost lost in the silence. Her words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before being swallowed up by the vast emptiness around her. The sky above her was a swirl of light and shadow, as if it were on the verge of becoming something else, something more. Her heart began to race again as she took a hesitant step forward. She could feel the weight of her choice settling on her shoulders, a heavy, undeniable presence that reminded her that she had crossed a line. There was no turning back now. The path she had chosen was the only one left for her, and whatever lay ahead, she would face it. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled once more, and a deep, rumbling sound echoed through the plain. It started off low, like a growl from the depths of the earth, but quickly built into something far more intense. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she instinctively took a step back, her body tensing in anticipation. The rumbling grew louder, shaking the earth beneath her, and the sky above her darkened, the swirling clouds twisting into ominous shapes. From the distance she saw it, movement. At first it was small, barely noticeable, but then it grew larger, closer. Shapes appeared, figures emerging from the shadows of the grass, moving with a purposeful stride. They were not human, at least not in the way Sarah understood. The shapes were elongated, their forms stretched and contorted, like shadows given life. Their eyes glowed faintly in the twilight, burning with an eerie, unnatural light. Sarah took another step back, but there was nowhere to run. The figures were closing in, their movements swift, their presence overwhelming. There was no escape. The first one reached her in an instant. It was tall, easily 7 feet, its body wrapped in dark, tattered robes that seemed to flicker and shift, as though they were made of the very darkness of the sky. Its face was hidden, but Sarah could feel its gaze, feel its eyes burning into her soul, as if it could see everything she was, everything she had been, everything she feared. The creature spoke, but its voice was not a voice at all. It was a presence, a force that vibrated through the air, a whisper in her mind that made her skin crawl. "You have chosen," it said, the words resonating in the very fabric of her being. "Now you must face the consequences." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry, her pulse pounding in her ears. The creature's words were heavy with meaning, laden with something she could not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. This was not over. As the figures closed in around her, the world shifted again, and she felt the ground beneath her feet tremble once more. She had crossed the threshold, but what had she truly chosen? What would this new path bring her? What was waiting for her beyond the veil of light and darkness that separated the worlds? The answers were still out of reach, but one thing was certain. She would face them no matter what came. The rumbling grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the very core of Sarah's being as the figures circled her. The air had turned thick with a strange, oppressive weight, as if every breath she took was a struggle against the pressure that pressed down from all sides. The twilight sky above had darkened into an abyssal blackness, the swirling clouds casting shadows that danced across the land, moving with a life of their own. It was as if the entire world had become an extension of her fears, each dark corner a reflection of her inner turmoil. The creature in front of her, the one that had spoken, did not move closer, but it exuded an aura of power, of authority, that held Sarah in place, making it impossible to look away. It stood tall and unmoving, its dark robes flickering in the unnatural breeze, the edges of its form bending and twisting in ways that made it appear less like a figure and more like a shadow, a distortion of reality itself. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, glowed with a faint, otherworldly light, burning with the intensity of ancient knowledge and untold power. As the creature's gaze fixed on her, Sarah felt something within herself stir, a flicker of recognition, though she couldn't understand why. It wasn't just the power it exuded, it was something else. A feeling that this being, whatever it was, had been a part of her journey long before this moment. It was as though it had always been with her, watching her, waiting for her to come to this point. And now here she was standing before it, waiting for what came next. The silence was suffocating. The only sound was the hum of energy that pulsed through the air, vibrating in her chest, making her heart pound in her throat. Then, slowly, the creature moved. Its long, thin arms extended outward, the motion fluid, almost ethereal, like it was a part of the wind itself, the darkness, a being not confined by the rules of the physical world. As it reached toward her, its long fingers curled in a deliberate gesture, as if inviting her closer, as if daring her to take the next step. Sarah instinctively took a step back, but she knew she could not escape. Not now. Not from this place. The figures around her closed in, forming a circle, their movements synchronized, a seamless dance of shadow and light. Their eyes, those glowing, unsettling orbs, burned through her, and for a fleeting moment she felt completely exposed, like they could see every thought, every secret, every fear she had ever held. The air around her shimmered, and the creature that had spoken, the one in front of her, finally broke its silence again, its voice low, vibrating through the very air. "You have chosen," it repeated, its tone reverberating with a force that seemed to shatter the stillness around them. "But the path you walk now is not the same as the one you left behind. You have crossed into the heart of the threshold. You have crossed into the unknown. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. The word sent a shiver down her spine, and she instinctively clenched her fists. She had known that the path she had chosen would be difficult, would come with consequences, but she had never imagined this. She had thought the unknown would be a place of peace, a place where she could escape, where she could find answers, but this felt like something else, something far more dangerous. Why? She managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. Why am I here? What is this place? The creature's head tilted slightly as though considering her question. For a long moment, it said nothing, and Sarah could feel the weight of its gaze, a deep, penetrating stare that seemed to see straight through her. And then, in a voice like the rumble of distant thunder, it spoke again. This is the place where all choices converge, it said, its voice rising and falling like a chant. The threshold, the space between, where the past, present, and future all meet. Here, the threads of fate are woven, and all paths converge into a single point. What you choose now will ripple through all worlds, all realities. Every action, every choice, will reverberate across the fabric of existence. Sarah's heart clenched. She had thought she was just a victim, a wanderer lost in this strange world, but now, it was clear that she had become part of something far bigger than herself. She was not just facing her own fears, her own past. She was facing the very core of existence itself, the intertwining of all that had been, all that was, and all that was yet to come. What am I supposed to do? She asked, her voice trembling now as the enormity of the situation began to sink in. She had never asked for this, never wanted this responsibility, but it was hers now. She couldn't undo it. She couldn't turn back. The creature's figure shifted, and the others around her began to move as well, their movements flowing together like the tide, like a living, breathing entity. The air around Sarah seemed to grow heavier still, the energy in the space intensifying. It was as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to come. And then, just as she thought she couldn't bear the weight of it any longer, the creature spoke again, its voice now softer, more measured, as if imparting a piece of ancient wisdom. You are the choice, it said. Not the path, not the outcome. You are the thread that binds all things together. And now you must choose again. Sarah frowned, confusion clouding her thoughts. What do you mean? I've already chosen. I chose to move forward, to face whatever comes. The creature's glowing eyes flickered, as if amused by her misunderstanding. You chose to face what lies ahead, but you have yet to choose how to face it. What you are, what you become, will define the world you return to. The future is not set. The past is not fixed. You hold the power to reshape all that was and all that could be, but only you can choose how to wield it. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. It wasn't enough to simply walk through the threshold. She wasn't here just to survive, to escape. She was here to reshape everything, to change the very nature of the world, of the path she had been walking. The weight of this knowledge settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had been running from the darkness, from the fear of losing herself, of losing the people she loved. But now she had the power to change that, to alter the very course of fate itself. She wasn't just another lost soul drifting through the void. She was something more. She was the key to it all. Her mind raced as she processed the creature's words, the enormity of what it had said sinking in. This wasn't just about escaping the nightmare she had found herself in, it was about reshaping it. About taking control of the shadows that had haunted her, the monsters that had chased her, and turning them into something else entirely. Something she could control. The figures around her seemed to shift, to grow in stature, their forms more distinct now, more defined. They were no longer just shadowy figures, they were something else. Something ancient. Each one of them seemed to embody a different aspect of the darkness she had faced, each one a reflection of her own fear, her own past. But as they moved closer, Sarah no longer saw them as threats. She saw them as part of her, pieces of herself that she needed to understand, to reconcile with, in order to move forward. Choose, the creature whispered, its voice now echoing inside her mind. Choose how to shape your world. Choose who you will become. Sarah's heart raced as she realized the truth. She had the power. She had always had the power. The shadows, the darkness, they were a part of her, and now she had the ability to change them, to change herself. The question was no longer what could she do? It was who would she choose to be? The figures surrounding her held their gaze, their eyes burning with an ancient, knowing light. And for the first time since entering this place, Sarah felt a sense of calm. The fear that had gripped her heart was replaced with something else, something more powerful. Determination. The world around her seemed to bend and shift, the shadows retreating, the air lightening as she stepped forward, a new purpose in her heart. "I choose," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. The world held its breath. The world seemed to pause as Sarah spoke the words. The air itself seemed to stretch, crackling with energy, each particle in the space around her vibrating with an unspoken understanding. The figures around her, those shadowy, shifting beings, began to fade, retreating into the distance, their glowing eyes dimming until they were mere whispers in the dark. It was as if the very act of her choosing had altered the fabric of the world, changing everything around her in an instant. The rumble of energy that had filled the air fell into a deep, silent lull, leaving behind a strange calm. The pressure that had been pressing down on her chest, the weight that had threatened to crush her, was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of clarity. Sarah could feel it now, the power coursing through her, filling every part of her being. It wasn't just her mind that had changed. It was something deeper, something more. She stood there, her eyes wide, her body trembling with the sheer force of what had just happened. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but from the rush of realization, the knowledge that she was no longer just a passive observer in this world. She was a creator. The paths, the threads of fate, the very fabric of reality itself, she could shape it. The landscape around her began to shift again, but this time it felt different. Where before the land had seemed vast, empty, and disconnected, it now felt alive. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with energy, responding to her thoughts, her will. The grasses swayed, not just in the wind, but as if they were moving toward her, bending in response to her presence. The trees, far off in the distance, began to ripple, their leaves shimmering as though they were breathing, each one a reflection of the life Sarah had just unlocked within herself. The sky too shifted. The swirling black clouds began to break apart, revealing the faintest glow of a rising sun, as if the very heavens were now bowing to her will. The light was soft, almost ethereal, casting long, delicate rays that seemed to dance across the land, tracing the contours of the earth in gold and silver. It wasn't daylight exactly, but it was the light of something new, something born of Sarah's choice. It was the beginning of something that had never existed before. And then, from the horizon, something else began to emerge. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow against the glow of the new sky, but as it grew closer, Sarah could see its shape. A figure, tall and regal, walking toward her through the grass. Its silhouette was dark, framed by the light behind it, but there was no malice in its presence. No fear. This figure was different from the ones that had surrounded her earlier. There was no hunger in its eyes, no ominous aura. There was only a sense of purpose. As the figure drew closer, Sarah could make out the details. It was humanoid, but with an ethereal, almost ghostly quality. Its robes shimmered in the soft light, woven from something that resembled the very air itself, translucent, iridescent, as if they were made of the dawn itself. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but Sarah could feel its gaze, deep and knowing, settling on her. The figure stopped just a few feet away, standing still as if waiting for something. Sarah took a cautious step forward, her heart still racing, but now with a sense of anticipation, not fear. This being, this entity was not a threat. She could feel it in her bones. It was something else. Something ancient, yet entirely familiar. "You have chosen," the figure said, its voice not heard with the ears, but felt deep within her, resonating through her chest, vibrating in her very soul. It was a voice of both light and shadow, of calm and chaos, of time and eternity. And in doing so, you have become something more. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry, her mind still trying to catch up with the enormity of everything that had happened. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure raised a hand, the movement slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. With a graceful gesture, it pointed to the land around them, to the shimmering grasses and the glowing trees, to the sky that now seemed alive with possibility. "You have stepped beyond the boundaries of your own existence," the figure said. "You have entered the space where all choices intertwine, where all paths converge. What you do now will shape not only your own world, but the worlds of countless others. The power you hold is not a burden, but a gift to create, to shape, to guide." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the true nature of her choice, the consequences that she had only just begun to comprehend. She had thought that stepping through the threshold would bring answers, bring clarity. But instead, it had given her something else, a power beyond anything she had ever known, a responsibility. "What am I supposed to do with this power?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know what I'm supposed to be." The figure lowered its hand, and for the first time, it spoke in a tone that was almost gentle, the sound like a breeze rustling through leaves. "You do not need to know what you will become," it said. "You only need to understand that you already are what the world needs. The choice you made was not to escape, but to forge a path forward. A path not bound by the constraints of the past, nor the fear of what may come. You are both the creator and the creation. And you are never alone in this." Sarah closed her eyes, letting the figure's words settle into her heart. She had never imagined that this was what her journey would lead to. She had thought she was simply surviving, running from the darkness, but now she saw the truth. She had been more than just a victim. She had been a participant, a force of change in a world that had been waiting for her to embrace her power. The figure's words were not just comforting, they were a call to action. She had not been brought to this place to be passive, to simply exist. She had been brought here to create, to change, to shape the future. The choices she made from this moment forward would ripple out across all worlds, all realities, and affect everything she had ever known, and everything she would come to know. The figure stepped forward, closing the distance between them, its presence filling the space with a soft, radiant glow. It stood before her, its gaze unwavering. "Will you take this gift?" it asked, its voice both soothing and commanding. "Will you wield this power with the wisdom of the ages and the courage of your heart? The path ahead will not be easy. There will be trials and there will be challenges. But you are ready." Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. The responsibility was overwhelming, but she could no longer deny it. She had chosen this. She had stepped through the threshold, embraced the unknown, and now she had to take the next step. "I will," she said, her voice steady. "I will shape the path ahead. I will make it my own." The figure nodded, and in that moment, Sarah felt a surge of energy unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if the very land around her responded to her words, the earth itself shifting in time with her declaration. The sky brightened, and the air grew warm, filled with the hum of creation, of possibility. And as the figure stepped back, its form dissolving into the soft light, Sarah knew that her journey had only just begun. The power was hers, but so was the responsibility. She had crossed the threshold, yes, but now she would shape the worlds. Her worlds. The soft hum of energy reverberated through Sarah's body as she stood there, the weight of her choice hanging in the air like a tangible force. The world around her continued to shift, to breathe with a life of its own, but she felt no fear now. The terrifying unknown that had once plagued her was no longer something to run from. Instead, it had become a canvas waiting for her to leave her mark. The figure, no, the being, had dissolved into the light, leaving behind an ethereal afterglow that lingered in the air. The figure had been her guide, her mentor in this moment of transformation, but now the responsibility was hers alone. No longer would she be the helpless wanderer at the mercy of the shadows. No longer would she be a prisoner of her past. She was free. Free to shape, to guide, to forge a new future for herself and for the world around her. The land before her stretched on, seemingly infinite. The grasses whispered in the soft breeze, their emerald tips brushing against the unseen rhythm of the air, bending and swaying in gentle unison. The trees that dotted the plain were alive, their branches swaying and rustling in time with the unseen pulse of the earth. Everything felt interconnected, alive, breathing, and waiting for her command. She could feel it in the air, the energy that pulsed beneath the surface of the world, waiting to be shaped, to be directed. Her fingers twitched at her sides, the weight of her newfound power settling into her palms. She had not asked for this gift, but now that it was hers, she could feel its potential stretching out before her, a vast expanse of possibility. It was not a force to be wielded recklessly, but it was hers to shape. She had become the weaver of her own destiny, the architect of her reality. She took a step forward, her feet sinking slightly into the soft earth. The ground beneath her seemed to embrace her, its coolness grounding her in the moment, pulling her deeper into this strange, timeless world. With each step, the land seemed to shift, as though responding to her presence, to her intentions. The air became thick with a soft, pulsing energy, and the sky above began to brighten in a steady, gradual rise, as though the sun was beginning to reclaim the night. But even as the light of dawn spread across the land, a part of Sarah's mind remained uneasy. There was something in the distance, something that had not shifted with the world, something that remained stagnant, waiting. She could feel it in the back of her mind, like a tug on her consciousness, something pulling at her, calling her. Her feet moved almost instinctively in the direction of the pull, though she did not fully understand why. The further she walked, the more the land began to change. The golden grasses turned to deep, dark earth, the trees becoming twisted and gnarled, their limbs reaching out like skeletal arms. The sky above began to darken again, clouds swirling in ominous patterns as if the very fabric of reality was becoming unstable. The pull grew stronger and soon she could see it. In the distance, a shape loomed, rising out of the earth like an ancient monolith. It was a structure, though not one that could be easily named. The architecture was strange, foreign, completely unlike anything Sarah had ever seen before. The structure towered over her, an enormous lodge, built of dark stone and twisted metal, its windows empty and lifeless. It seemed to exude an ancient energy, one that called to her, a memory buried deep in her soul. Without thinking, Sarah found herself moving faster, walking toward the lodge with a sense of urgency she couldn't explain. Each step she took seemed to bring her closer to something, a truth, perhaps, or a reckoning. When she finally reached the front steps, she hesitated. The door stood wide open as if it had been waiting for her. The dark interior beyond was shrouded in shadow, but even from where she stood, she could feel the weight of what lay inside. It wasn't just a building, it was a place of significance, of power, of history. She could feel the presence within, the force that seemed to pulse with life. The shadows in the corners of the building writhed, not like mere darkness, but as if they were alive, watching, waiting. For a moment, Sarah's heart began to race again. She had stepped into something bigger than herself, something that existed far beyond the simple choice she had made. She was no longer just shaping her own path. She was standing at the intersection of all paths, at the very center of something vast and ancient, a crossroads that held the power to change not just her world but every world. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the lodge. The air inside was cold, damp, and heavy with the scent of earth and decay. The floor beneath her feet creaked with every step she took, the sound echoing through the silent halls like a warning. The walls, made of dark, weathered stone, seemed to press in on her, their surface etched with symbols she could not understand. The very air felt thick, oppressive, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sarah continued forward, her pulse quickening with each step. She could hear something now, faint at first, but growing louder with every passing moment. A whispering, a soft murmur that seemed to be coming from the very walls, from the shadows themselves. It was unintelligible at first, but the longer she listened, the clearer it became, until it was no longer just a whisper, but a chorus of voices, each one speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The voices grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to communicate something to her, something important. Her steps slowed, her breath shallow as she approached the source of the sound. As she turned the corner, she came face to face with a massive, circular room, its ceiling lost in shadow, its walls adorned with strange, intricate carvings that seemed to shift and change as she looked at them. At the center of the room was an altar, its surface covered in symbols and runes she didn't understand. It pulsed with a dark energy, the same energy that seemed to fill the air around her. The voices were louder now, swirling in her mind, each one louder than the last, until they filled her entire consciousness, pushing her to the brink of madness. The words were still unintelligible, but she could feel their meaning, a warning, a plea, a call. And then she saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, its form barely visible against the dark backdrop of the room. It was tall, shrouded in a flowing cloak, its face hidden beneath a hood. The air around it seemed to crackle with an ancient power, a power that made her skin tingle and her heart race. It was the source of the voices. The figure was the one calling to her, pulling her into this place. "Come closer," a voice said, and this time Sarah could hear it clearly. It was deep, resonant, filled with a quiet authority. "You have come so far, Sarah. But you must understand. There are forces at work that you do not yet comprehend." The figure's voice sent a chill down her spine, but she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, the weight of the decision pressing on her shoulders. She had made her choice to come here, to face whatever this was. She could not turn back now. As she moved closer to the figure, the air seemed to grow colder still, the shadows deepening around her. The voices fell silent, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her next move. "You have already changed the course of your world," the figure continued, its voice soft, almost sorrowful. "But you must know that there are other worlds, other realities that are tied to your fate. What you choose to do here will not only affect you, it will affect them all. The power you hold now is not just yours. It is shared, interwoven with all that is." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. The weight of the words, the responsibility they carried, pressed on her like 1,000 invisible hands. She had stepped into the unknown, yes, but now she understood that the unknown was far larger than she had ever imagined. The power to shape her world was hers, but so was the power to shape countless others. "I understand," she said, her voice firm, though her heart raced. "I'm ready." The figure nodded, and in that moment, Sarah knew that whatever came next would change everything. Her journey had led her here, to this moment, where the fate of all things rested in her hands. And now she had to decide what kind of future she would create. The silence in the room stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Every breath Sarah took seemed to echo in the cold air, the weight of the figure's words hanging in the space like a heavy fog. She had chosen to come this far, but now that she was here, standing at the center of this ancient, sacred place, the enormity of what she had taken on was starting to settle over her, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The figure, still cloaked in shadow, did not move. Its presence filled the room with an oppressive energy, one that was both ancient and unyielding. It was as though it was a guardian of this place, a sentinel that had been waiting for her, watching over the threshold she had crossed. Sarah stood still, her mind racing. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her gaze remained steady, fixed on the figure before her. The voices that had once whispered in the air were now completely silent, as if they were waiting for something to happen. The only sound was the soft creak of the ancient stones beneath her feet, a subtle reminder that time had long since passed in this place. "Do you understand the weight of your choice?" the figure asked, its voice low and resonant, like the rumble of thunder in the distance. The words seemed to reverberate through her very bones, vibrating deep within her. Sarah took a deep breath, her hands trembling at her sides. She had faced the unknown, made the choice to step into this world, to cross the threshold into something greater than herself. But now, faced with the consequences of that decision, the truth of what it meant to wield such power settled over her like a blanket of ice. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within her. "I understand. I didn't just choose to change my world. I chose to shape everything, every world, every reality. I chose to be the one who decides the course of all that is." The figure nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as though it had known this answer was coming. "Good," it said, its voice softer now, more compassionate. "But understand this, Sarah. You do not wield this power as a weapon. You are not a conqueror. You are a creator, a guardian. Your choices will ripple across the fabric of existence, but they must be made with wisdom, with care. The balance you hold is fragile." The figure's words sent a chill through her, but they were not words of warning. They were words of responsibility. She had crossed a threshold, yes, but now she had to carry the burden of what came next. She was not just a player in this game of fate, she was the one who set the rules. Sarah's eyes flickered around the room, taking in the details that had previously escaped her notice. The walls, made of ancient stone, were etched with symbols. Symbols that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them, as though they were alive, changing in response to her thoughts. The altar at the center of the room seemed to pulse with a subtle energy, its surface etched with runes that she now recognized. These were the same runes she had seen in the trees outside, the same symbols that had surrounded her when she first crossed into this world. The air was thick with magic, with ancient power, but it wasn't the oppressive energy that had once filled the place. It was something else, something more alive, more hopeful, as though the very essence of creation had been waiting for her to step forward and claim it. The power was hers now, but it was not hers alone. The world, the land, the people, they all had a stake in what she would do next. She could feel it deep within her. This was the moment of decision. The path ahead was hers to walk, but the choices she made would affect everything, everyone. The future, the past, and the present were all tangled together in a single, fragile thread, and it was up to her to decide what to weave into it. "Tell me what I must do," Sarah said, her voice calm now, but her heart still pounding in her chest. "I'm ready." The figure's gaze softened, its eyes glimmering faintly from beneath the hood, and for the first time, it spoke in a tone that was not just authoritative but understanding. "It is not a question of what you must do," it said. "It is a question of what you choose to do. The power you hold now is not given lightly, nor is it easily understood. But you must find your own path, Sarah. The worlds you will shape will be reflections of your choices. You are the one who will decide whether they flourish or fall." The room seemed to darken for a moment, the shadows gathering around her like a blanket. But even in the darkness, Sarah could feel the weight of the figure's presence, the ancient energy that surrounded them both. The air hummed with the promise of untold possibilities, of futures not yet written, but waiting to be forged. "What if I fail?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, but she needed to ask it. She needed to know if the power she had claimed could be lost just as easily as it had been gained. The figure was silent for a long moment, as if considering her question carefully. Then it spoke, its voice softer now, almost gentle. Failure is not the end, Sarah. It is simply a part of the journey. The worlds you create may not be perfect, but they will be yours. The mistakes you make will shape them just as your triumphs will. It is all part of the great tapestry. There is no such thing as a world without darkness, nor one without light. It is the balance of both that makes them real, makes them alive. Sarah's mind whirled as she processed the figure's words. She had not chosen this path to create a perfect world. She had chosen it to create something that was hers to shape, to mold, to guide. The darkness would be there, yes, but it would not be the end of everything. It would simply be a part of the whole, a necessary piece of the larger picture. The power to shape the world was hers, but it was not a power to be wielded recklessly. It was a power to be carried with care, with understanding, and with a deep respect for the forces at play. She was not just a creator, she was a keeper, a guardian of the balance. I understand, Sarah said, her voice steady now. She could feel it. This was the moment where everything began, where the world shifted again under her feet. The responsibility was immense, but it was also a gift. She had been chosen for this task, and now it was up to her to rise to it. The figure nodded slowly, its hooded head dipping in approval. You are ready, it said, its voice reverberating in the chamber. The path is yours to walk, Sarah. The worlds you create will be born of your choices, your wisdom, and your heart. But remember, what you shape will not just reflect you. It will reflect all that is, all that could be. Sarah took a deep breath, the weight of her decision settling into her bones. The power was hers. The future was hers to create. And with that, the darkness around her began to shift once again. The walls of the lodge, the stone altar, the symbols etched into the air, they all seemed to pulse with a new energy, a new life. It was the beginning of something greater, something vast and beautiful. It was a world waiting to be shaped, waiting to be born, and she would be the one to bring it to life. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stood there, feeling the pulse of power radiating from the very core of the lodge. The figure before her, its form still cloaked in shadow, had imparted the wisdom of the ages, and now it was time for her to take the next step. She had chosen to walk this path, to hold the reins of destiny in her hands. The weight of it was almost overwhelming, but it was also exhilarating. This was her moment, her time to create, to shape the world she would leave behind. The air around her shimmered, the energy in the room becoming more vibrant with each passing second. It was as if the very walls of the lodge, the stones that had stood for centuries, were responding to her presence, to the power she now commanded. The hum of magic, ancient, deep, and alive, coursed through the air, vibrating in the depths of her bones, urging her forward, urging her to embrace the responsibility she had claimed. She took a deep breath, letting the energy fill her, flow through her. The figure remained silent, its gaze steady, watching her with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the layers of time and space. Sarah could feel its presence, a steady, guiding force, but it was no longer the only one. The energy of the lodge, of the world, was now hers to command. The possibilities were endless, and yet, in the vastness of it all, there was a growing sense of purpose within her. The voice of the figure broke through the silence, its words resonating deep within her chest. What you do now will echo across all the worlds, Sarah. What you create will live on long after you are gone. The balance you strike here will ripple through time, altering the course of every reality you touch. Remember that what you shape is not only for yourself, but for all that exists. You will be the guardian, the creator, the keeper of the balance. The weight of the figure's words pressed heavily on Sarah's shoulders, but in them she found clarity. She had not simply chosen to reshape her world. She had chosen to take the mantle of creation itself, to weave new realities into existence, to become the very force that guided their birth. It was a responsibility that no one could bear lightly, and yet, Sarah knew she was the one meant to carry it. The figure stepped back slightly, its silhouette fading into the shadows as though it had completed its task. The time has come, it said, its voice softer now, like the final whisper of a passing wind. You must decide how to begin. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected this moment to come so quickly, but now that it was here, she knew what she had to do. The first step was always the hardest, but it was the most important. Her hands trembled at her sides as she stepped forward, her fingers brushing against the cool stone of the altar. The runes on the surface glowed faintly beneath her touch, reacting to her presence, to the power she now wielded. The air thickened with magic, and as Sarah focused on the runes, the symbols seemed to shift and dance before her eyes. They were a language she could not understand, a language of creation itself. Without thinking, she closed her eyes and let her mind reach out, allowing herself to become one with the energy around her. She could feel it, this ancient power that had been waiting for someone like her to awaken it. She could feel the very fabric of reality stretching out before her, a vast web of possibilities that only she could shape. The first thread of creation began to unravel in her mind. It was a whisper at first, just a flicker of an idea, but it grew stronger as she focused. She saw a world much like the one she had known, but different in subtle, profound ways. It was a place of balance, a place where light and darkness coexisted, where the forces of nature and magic wove together seamlessly. A place where life thrived, and where the struggles of existence gave rise to beauty and strength. The vision unfolded before her, vibrant and full of potential. She could see the mountains rising from the earth, their peaks dusted with snow. She could see the forests stretching for miles, their ancient trees whispering with the wind. The rivers ran crystal clear, feeding the land, while the sky above held the soft hues of an eternal twilight. It was a place of harmony, where each element worked in concert with the others, creating a world that was alive, breathing, and vibrant. Sarah's hands moved instinctively, the runes on the altar responding to her intentions. They shifted, swirling into patterns that she could not yet fully comprehend, but that she knew were part of the process, part of the magic that flowed through her. The world she was shaping began to take form, piece by piece, each thread of creation woven carefully into place. She felt the power surging within her, the magic of the world flowing through her fingertips, through her very soul. It was both overwhelming and exhilarating, a torrent of energy that threatened to consume her, but she held it in check. She knew she had to be careful. Every decision she made would echo across the realms. She was the architect now, and her choices would shape the future. But as she continued to focus on the vision of the world before her, something shifted. A shadow, a flicker of something dark, slipped into the edges of her creation. It was subtle at first, just a ripple in the fabric of the world she was weaving, but it was there, unmistakable. The darkness was not something she could ignore. It was a part of the balance, a necessary force that would define the beauty of the light. Sarah paused, her hands hovering over the altar as she considered this. The darkness was not something she could simply remove, nor should she. It was a part of the natural order, a counterbalance to the light. Without it, the world would be incomplete. But how much darkness could she allow? How much was too much? Her mind raced as she searched for the answer. She could feel the pull of the darkness calling to her, but she resisted it for now. She would not allow the shadow to consume her creation, to overshadow the light. But she knew that a world without darkness was a world without contrast, without growth. It was a delicate balance she would have to find. As she concentrated, the shadows around her seemed to grow deeper, as if they were reaching out, stretching toward her. They whispered in her ears, their voices low and insistent, trying to pull her toward them. But Sarah remained focused, her will stronger than the whispering call of the darkness. Balance, she whispered to herself. I must create balance. She raised her hands, feeling the magic surge through her once more. The world she had begun to shape was not just a place of light, but one of contrast. A place where shadows could exist alongside light, where fear could give birth to courage, and where the unknown could give rise to understanding. It was a world that would thrive not in spite of the darkness, but because of it. With a final, deliberate gesture, Sarah wove the last thread into the fabric of the world she had created. The runes on the altar shifted and settled into place, their patterns now complete. The darkness had not overtaken the light, but it had found its place within it, a quiet partner in the dance of creation. She opened her eyes, and the world she had begun to shape unfolded before her. It was no longer just a vision, it was real. The land stretched out before her, vast and full of potential. She could feel the heartbeat of the world, a rhythm that was both steady and alive. The air was thick with magic, the promise of a new beginning. But as Sarah stood there, gazing at the world she had created, she knew that this was only the beginning. The threads of creation had been woven, but they were not yet complete. There was more to do, more to understand. The power she had called forth was vast, and it would take time for her to truly master it. She had created one world, but there were many more to shape, many more realities to touch, to guide. And with each one she would be tested. But for now, she stood at the edge of a new beginning. The power was hers, but it was not hers alone. She was not just a creator, she was a guardian, a keeper of balance. The world she shaped would be reflections of her choices, of her wisdom. And in that moment, Sarah understood. This was her journey, her legacy. The world was hers to create, but how it would unfold was yet to be seen. Sarah stood at the heart of the world she had created, her eyes tracing the contours of the land that now stretched before her. The sky above was a canvas of muted hues, soft purples and blues blending into the golden glow of an eternal twilight. The land was vast, teeming with potential, and the air hummed with an unseen energy, a pulse that resonated through the very ground beneath her feet. It was alive, breathing, waiting for her to take the next step. The energy that surged through her was palpable. It wasn't just power, it was something more profound, something ancient that had been awakened in her. She could feel the weight of it, the endless possibilities that were now hers to command. Yet, as the creator of this new world, the responsibility weighed heavily on her shoulders. Every choice, every decision, would ripple out across the land she had formed, leaving a trail of consequences she would have to face. The figure who had guided her here, who had imparted upon her the knowledge of creation, was now gone. Its presence had faded into the ether, leaving behind only its words and its wisdom. Yet, even in its absence, Sarah could still feel its gaze upon her. It was not a physical presence, but something much deeper, an eternal watchful eye that would forever guide her, though not with force, but with quiet encouragement. The world was hers now, but how would she shape it? What kind of place would she create? As she pondered this, Sarah's gaze turned to the horizon, where the first signs of life began to appear. The grasses at her feet swayed in a breeze that she could not feel, but which she knew was there. The trees on the distant hills creaked and groaned, their roots deep in the earth, their branches reaching toward the heavens. It was a place of balance, this land between light and shadow, between what was and what could be. But she had not yet finished. The world she had created was still raw, unfinished, waiting for her to guide it. It was not a world of perfection. It was a world of potential. It was alive with possibility, but it needed to be nurtured. The light needed the dark to keep it grounded, and the shadows needed the light to give them shape. There would be no world without both. Sarah closed her eyes, her mind reaching out once more, stretching beyond the limits of her body, beyond the walls of the lodge, beyond the land she had created. She could feel it then, the pull of other worlds, the tether between them all. She had not just created this one place. No, she had touched the fabric of reality itself, weaving a thread into the vast web of existence. With her power came a new understanding, that creation was not a solitary act. To create one world was to touch all worlds. They were all interconnected, like threads in a tapestry, woven together by the same unseen force. She could feel the weight of that connection now, the responsibility that came with it. And yet, there was something else, a quiet whisper at the back of her mind, a nagging pull that urged her forward. There was more to be done, something she had yet to uncover. She could feel it deep within her, a part of herself that was still missing. The world she had created was beautiful, but it was not complete. It was a reflection of herself, yes, but it lacked something crucial, a key piece that she had not yet unlocked. She turned from the horizon and began walking, her footsteps silent on the earth beneath her. She could sense the magic in the air, the energy that connected everything. The trees whispered to her as she passed, their leaves brushing gently against her skin as if in greeting. The earth beneath her feet pulsed with a quiet hum, as though the land itself recognized her as its creator. But as Sarah walked deeper into the forest, something began to change. The air grew thicker, more charged, and the sounds around her shifted. The whispers of the trees became softer, more distant. The vibrant energy she had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by an eerie stillness that seemed to creep along the edges of her mind. It was subtle at first, but Sarah could feel it. Something was wrong. She stopped and looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows between the trees. There, just beyond the reach of the twilight, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, shifted between the trunks. It was fleeting, but Sarah could feel it, an unnatural presence, something that did not belong. It was the darkness she had woven into her creation, but this was something different. Her heart began to race. The presence was growing stronger, pulling at the edges of her mind, tugging at her very soul. She could feel its cold grip tightening, and in that moment, Sarah understood. This was the balance she had been warned about. Darkness was not just a counter to the light, it was a force in its own right, something that could not be controlled, not fully. And this particular darkness was not something she had intended to create. The shadow flickered again, closer this time, moving with purpose. Sarah took a step back, her eyes narrowed. This was no natural part of the world. This was something that had slipped through the cracks, a corruption of the balance she had strived to maintain. And it was growing. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, and the air turned cold. The once gentle whispers of the trees became frantic, their leaves trembling as if in fear. The energy of the land, which had once been so alive with potential, now felt strained, as if the very fabric of her creation was being pulled apart. Sarah clenched her fists at her sides, a surge of determination rising within her. She had created this world, and she would not allow it to be consumed by this darkness. Not now, not ever. She had to act, and she had to act quickly. Closing her eyes, she focused, calling on the power that resided within her. The energy of the world, the magic that flowed through every tree, every stone, every living thing, it was hers to command. She reached deep within herself, feeling the pulse of the world beat in time with her own heart. She could sense the corruption spreading like a stain on the fabric of the world, but she could also feel the power that could cleanse it. With a single forceful movement, she extended her hands forward, and the magic surged from her, radiating outward in a pulse of light. The land responded to her call, the earth shaking as energy flowed from her fingertips, filling the air with a brilliant glow. The darkness recoiled, retreating for a moment as the light washed over it, but it was not gone. The shadow flickered again, more intense now, like a beast cornered and desperate to escape. "No," Sarah whispered through clenched teeth. "This world is mine, and I will not let you destroy it." She pressed her palms together, focusing all the energy within her into a single, concentrated force. The light that emanated from her hands grew brighter, hotter, until it felt as though the very sun itself was burning from within her. The darkness hissed, its edges curling away from the light, but it was not enough to banish it. The shadow had learned from her power. It was not simply afraid of it, it was feeding on it, growing stronger. In that moment, Sarah realized that the light alone would not be enough. She had created balance, yes, but balance required both light and shadow, both creation and destruction. It was the very nature of existence itself. And so, Sarah did not banish the darkness. Instead, she embraced it. Drawing in a deep breath, she closed her eyes once more, feeling the pull of both light and shadow within her. The darkness was not to be feared, it was a part of the world, a part of her. She reached out with both hands, weaving the energies of both into a single thread, twisting light and shadow together, binding them into a force of creation. The land around her seemed to sigh as she did so, as if the very earth itself understood what she was doing. When she opened her eyes, the world had changed. The darkness was no longer an enemy to be fought. It was a part of the creation, woven into the fabric of the land like the roots of the trees. It was still there, lurking in the corners of the world, but now it had a place. It was not to be destroyed, but to be understood. The balance had been restored. The air lightened, the ground beneath her feet grew firm once again, and the shadows that had once threatened to overwhelm her creation receded into their rightful place. The land hummed with a new energy, one that was both calming and powerful. She had done it. She had not just created a world, she had created a balance, one that would endure. And now Sarah understood. This world, this creation, was hers to guide, to protect. The darkness and the light were not opposites, they were partners. Together they would shape the future. The journey was far from over. It had only just begun. Sarah stood amidst the world she had crafted, her breath steady, her heart still racing with the aftermath of what she had just done. The air hummed with a new kind of harmony, the world around her alive and buzzing with potential. But as the pulse of the land settled into a steady rhythm, the weight of what had transpired hung heavily upon her. The darkness, once a threat to her creation, now existed as part of the balance she had woven. She had not cast it away, nor had she embraced it blindly. She had accepted its place, acknowledging that it was as necessary as the light itself. It was a force that could not be controlled by sheer will, but one that required respect. And in doing so, she had transformed it. No longer a destroyer, but a creator in its own right, capable of shaping the land just as much as the light. As the land around her grew still, Sarah took a moment to breathe deeply, feeling the vibrations of life beneath her feet. She was connected to it, to everything. The trees, the stones, the air, everything was part of her now, and she was part of it. The power she had summoned and shaped had become a living force, its currents flowing through the earth, the sky, the very heartbeat of the world. But it wasn't just a power she held. It was a power she shared. It was then that she realized creation was not a singular act. It was a constant, evolving process. She had given birth to this world, but it would not remain static. It was a living thing, and it needed to grow, to change. And so, Sarah knew her journey was not just about creating this world, it was about nurturing it, guiding it as it blossomed into something that would transcend her, something that would live beyond her. Her feet began to move instinctively, carrying her through the landscape she had made. The forest had changed too since her last encounter with the shadow. The trees stood taller, their leaves more vibrant, their roots deeper in the soil. The earth itself felt richer, more fertile, as if the balance had breathed new life into it. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of rain-drenched earth, mingling with the fresh tang of pine. It was a world in bloom, a place of infinite potential. As Sarah walked, she saw something new: life. It was subtle at first, tiny sprouts pushing through the soil, wildflowers dotting the edges of the forest path. The animals, too, had begun to stir, emerging from the woods in cautious curiosity. Birds flew overhead, their wings cutting through the cool twilight, and small creatures scurried beneath the underbrush, drawn by the promise of the world she had created. Yet, despite the beauty of it all, Sarah felt a lingering unease. The darkness was still present, though more contained now, more grounded. She could feel it in the corners of her mind, like a presence that watched, waited. It was not a malevolent force, but something far older, far more complex. She had not defeated it. She had only acknowledged its place within the weave of creation. Her mind turned toward the figure, the mysterious entity that had guided her. It had vanished after the moment of creation, but its absence left behind an indelible mark. What had it meant when it said she was the guardian of this world? What did it mean to guard a world that was not just her own, but a part of something much greater? She stopped walking, her gaze sweeping across the land. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also fragile. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest again. She was not just a creator. She was a protector. The balance she had achieved could so easily be undone, the dark forces she had woven into the world threatening to tip the scale. She had to remain vigilant. She had to remain strong. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward once again. She knew there was no turning back now, no retreating to the safety of ignorance. She had chosen to create, and now she had to choose to protect. The path ahead was one of constant evolution, one where each step would define not just her fate, but the fate of the world itself. She wandered deeper into the heart of the forest, drawn by an instinct she couldn't explain. As she walked, the land around her grew wilder. The trees were denser here, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches twisted like the limbs of ancient creatures. The air was thick with moisture, and the sounds of distant thunder rumbled softly in the distance. The world was alive here, but it was a world that needed tending. This was not just a place of balance, it was a place of constant change, of flux. In the distance, Sarah saw a figure moving between the trees. Her heart quickened. The figure was tall, almost impossibly so, draped in a cloak made of darkness, its face obscured by a hood. It was not a person, at least not like any person she had known. It was something else, something ancient, something that belonged to the very fabric of the world she had woven. Her feet carried her forward, drawn to the figure as if by an invisible force. The air grew colder, heavier as she approached. The figure did not move, but stood in the shadows, waiting for her. When Sarah reached it, the figure turned, its cloak flowing behind it like a cascade of darkness. Its face was hidden, but she could feel its eyes on her. "You've done well." The voice was deep, resonant, like a distant thunderclap. "But this world is not yet what it could be." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure's presence was like a weight, like the sky itself had descended upon her. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady, though her heart raced. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, studying her. The cloak billowed, swirling around it as though it were made of smoke. "I am the keeper," the figure finally spoke, its voice distant, like the echo of a forgotten storm. "I am the one who ensures the balance remains. You have woven the threads of creation well, but you have not yet understood what they mean." A chill ran through Sarah as she absorbed the words. "What do you mean?" she asked, stepping forward. "I've created balance. I've made this world." The figure did not respond immediately, its silence stretching between them like a living thing. It then stepped forward, moving with an unnatural grace, its cloak flowing like liquid shadows. "The balance you've created is fragile," it said softly, its voice heavy with the weight of ages. "You have woven together light and shadow, but the threads you've woven are not yet secure. They are still in the process of being stitched into the fabric of existence. And without the proper care, they will unravel." The words hit Sarah like a sudden storm. "But I have done everything. I have made the world. It is alive." The keeper nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. Yes, it is alive. But life is not something you can merely create and abandon. It is something you must maintain. The darkness you've woven is not merely an element of the world. It is a force, one that will need your attention, your guidance. Left unchecked, it will seek to grow, to consume the light. Sarah stood still, her mind racing. She had thought she understood. She had thought that by weaving the light and the shadow together, she had created a world that would flourish, a world that could stand on its own. But now she realized the truth. She had created something far more complex than she had ever imagined. This was not just about creation. It was about stewardship. It was about tending to the land, to the balance, to the very fabric of existence itself. The keeper stepped back, its figure blending into the shadows of the forest, and for a moment, Sarah felt a deep, unsettling stillness settle over her. The world she had woven was hers, yes, but it was not yet complete. It needed her more than ever. And as she turned and began to walk deeper into the forest, she knew the journey ahead would be even more challenging than she had ever anticipated. But now she was ready. She had created the world. Now she would protect it. Sarah's footsteps echoed softly in the quiet forest as she continued deeper into the heart of the land she had brought into existence. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, mingling with the faint, almost imperceptible scent of magic, something ancient and powerful that hung in the air like a living thing. The trees above were tall and imposing, their twisted branches reaching toward the heavens, creating a canopy that blocked out most of the twilight sky. The forest was alive, vibrant with life, but there was something darker here now, something deeper. A shadow, just on the edge of her awareness, seemed to move with her, always just out of sight, but always present, lurking in the spaces between the trees. She was not afraid. Not exactly. But she was aware. Aware that this world, this creation of hers, was more than just a peaceful sanctuary. It was a place of balance, and balance was something that required constant attention, constant care. The figure, the keeper, had warned her about the fragility of the world she had shaped. And now Sarah felt that fragility for herself. The darkness, though woven into the very fabric of the world, was not just an opposing force. It was a force in and of itself, a presence that could not be ignored or controlled. It was a presence that needed to be understood, contained, nurtured, and at times confronted. Her journey was far from over, and she knew it. The power she held within her was vast, limitless, almost, but it was not power to be used recklessly. She had to be careful. Every thread of creation she wove carried weight, carried meaning. The land she had shaped was still in its infancy, and she was its guardian. The keeper had made that clear. The responsibility she bore was not just that of a creator, it was that of a protector, a nurturer, someone who would ensure the delicate balance of this world was maintained. As she walked, her mind raced. She had to know more. She had to understand the true nature of the balance she was guarding. The shadow that lingered in the corners of her mind, it wasn't just an external force. It was part of her, part of the land she had shaped. But how much darkness was too much? And how much light could she allow before it became blinding? The whispers of the forest seemed to grow louder as she walked deeper, as though the very trees were trying to speak to her, to offer their wisdom. She stopped for a moment, closing her eyes, allowing herself to truly listen. The sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of birds, mingled with a deeper, more primal hum that vibrated beneath the earth. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to be alive with magic, with a pulse that was old and steady, like the heartbeat of the world itself. She stretched out her senses, feeling the magic that flowed through everything. The plants, the trees, the animals, they were all part of the energy that permeated this land. But it wasn't just the living things that were connected by this magic. The stones, the rivers, the very air, everything was bound together in a web of energy, a delicate thread that tied the land together. She could feel the threads pulling at her, the magic urging her to take action. The world was calling to her, asking her to shape it, to guide it, to keep it in balance. But how? How could she ensure that this world would not fall into chaos? How could she control the forces she had unleashed? She felt a pang of uncertainty, a sharp reminder that she was no longer simply a participant in this world, she was its architect. And with that role came a weight she had not fully understood. The forest around her was not just a creation, it was a living, breathing entity. And as its creator, she was bound to it. The darkness, the light, the creatures, the elements, they were all hers to protect, to nurture. She was its shepherd. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled. It was a slight vibration at first, just enough to catch her attention. But it grew stronger, the earth shifting beneath her as if something deep within the land was awakening. She felt it, a stirring, a rumble from the very heart of the world. Something was coming, something ancient and powerful, and it was drawing near. Sarah's pulse quickened. She instinctively placed her hand on the trunk of a nearby tree, grounding herself in the energy of the forest. The tree's bark was rough beneath her fingers, but its steady pulse helped to calm her racing thoughts. The vibration from the earth continued, now unmistakable, a force building in intensity, a force that had been lying dormant, waiting. The shadows between the trees began to shift, not with the wind, but as if they had a will of their own. Sarah looked up, her eyes narrowing as she felt the presence drawing closer. It wasn't the keeper. It wasn't just darkness. This was something else, something ancient, something primal. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to flee, but she stood still. She couldn't run. She was the creator of this world. She was the one who had brought it into being. She was its protector. And so she stayed. The trees around her groaned as the earth continued to shake. From the shadows, something large began to emerge. It was a figure, tall and imposing, but not human. Its form was obscured by a shifting cloak of darkness, its limbs elongated, its features hidden by a mask of shadows. It moved with an otherworldly grace, its eyes glowing faintly beneath the hood. The air around it crackled with energy, with power. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it now more clearly than before. The force that was standing before her was not just a creation of the world, it was the embodiment of the world itself. The land, the magic, the balance, it had all come together in this form. This creature was not an enemy. It was a part of the world she had created, a guardian just as she was. But it was far older than her, far more ancient. The figure stopped just in front of her, its head tilting slightly as it studied her. There was a deep, resonant hum in the air, a low sound that seemed to vibrate through Sarah's chest. "You have created this world." The figure's voice was deep, echoing through the forest like the rumbling of distant thunder. But creation is not an end. It is a beginning. And beginnings require constant tending. Sarah's voice was steady as she spoke, though her heart raced. "I understand. I will protect it." The figure nodded slowly, its glowing eyes never leaving her. "You have the power to shape, but you do not control. The world shapes itself as much as you shape it. There are forces in this land that are older than you, older than time itself. Forces you cannot yet understand." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine, but she stood her ground. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice clear. The figure's cloak swirled around it as it stepped closer, its presence both calming and unsettling. "I am here to remind you," it said softly. "You are not alone in this world. You are its creator, yes, but creation does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a web, a network of forces and energies that are beyond your comprehension. The balance you seek to protect is not just the balance of light and shadow. It is the balance of all things, life and death, creation and destruction, hope and despair. To maintain that balance, you must learn to listen to the land. You must learn to respect the forces you have awakened." The figure extended a long, slender hand, and Sarah instinctively stepped back. But the figure did not move to touch her. Instead, it extended its hand toward the sky, and the shadows around them seemed to deepen, swirling like a storm. "Darkness and light are not enemies," it continued, its voice growing more insistent. "They are partners, bound together in a delicate dance. The world is constantly shifting, constantly changing. And you must change with it, adapt to the forces you have set in motion." The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled again, but this time it wasn't just the rumble of power, it was the earth itself responding to the figure's words, a ripple of energy spreading out from the figure's hand. Sarah could feel the power, the raw, untamed magic of the world surging through her. It was as if the very land was awakening, stretching and groaning, calling to her. "The balance is delicate," the figure said, its voice echoing in the air. "Guard it well, for it is not a force that can be controlled. It can only be nurtured." Sarah nodded slowly, the weight of its words sinking in. She had created this world, but she had not created it in isolation. It was part of something much larger, a web of energy and forces that she was only beginning to understand. The shadows, the light, they were both necessary. But so much more was at play. The figure stepped back into the shadows, its form blending into the darkness. "Remember," it said, its voice fading with the wind. "Creation is a process. Never stop listening." And with that, it was gone. Sarah stood still in the midst of the forest, the weight of her responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She had created this world, but now she had to protect it. The balance was fragile, and the forces she had awakened were far greater than she had ever imagined. But she was ready. She had to be. The forest was still, and for a moment, Sarah stood alone beneath the canopy of ancient trees. The air was thick with the lingering echo of the figure's words, vibrating through the stillness. Creation is a process. Never stop listening. The weight of those words settled deep within her chest, like a seed planted in the soil, one that would grow and demand her attention. The forest around her seemed to hold its breath, the rustle of the leaves becoming more distant, as if the trees themselves were waiting for her next move. She had not expected the keeper's words, nor the appearance of the figure that had emerged from the shadows. They had been warnings, yes, but also invitations. Invitations to understand that she was not alone in this world, that her creation was not just hers to command, but part of a greater whole, an intricate web of energy, life, and death. The world she had shaped was alive, but it was still young, still vulnerable. She felt a deep, gnawing sense of urgency, a pull toward something she could not yet grasp. The darkness, the force that she had woven into her creation, was not something to be feared. No, it was something to be respected. But it was also something that needed to be held in check, nurtured, and understood. The shadow that lingered just beyond her reach was a presence that demanded attention, but it could not be allowed to grow unchecked. Her hand rested on the trunk of a nearby tree, its bark rough beneath her fingertips. The energy of the forest pulsed through her, a steady hum that vibrated against her skin. She could feel it now, the lifeblood of the world, coursing through every leaf, every branch, every stone. She could hear the whispers of the earth, the quiet murmurs of the creatures that called this place home, and the soft sigh of the wind as it passed through the canopy above. But the whispers were not all comforting. They were filled with urgency, with an unspoken warning. The darkness was not gone. It had only been contained for now, pushed back by the light that Sarah had woven into the world. But it was still there, growing, shifting beneath the surface. And it was only a matter of time before it found a way to break free. She turned away from the tree and began walking once again, her pace quickening as a sense of urgency stirred within her. She could feel the pull of the land, the pressure of the power that flowed through her. She was its creator, its guardian, but she was also its servant. The world she had made was not a thing to be possessed. It was a thing to be cared for, tended to, shaped with the same delicate hands that had created it. The deeper she walked into the forest, the thicker the shadows became. The trees here were older, their trunks wider, their branches more twisted. The air was cooler, heavier, and the sound of the wind had changed, carrying with it the scent of something new, something unfamiliar. The forest had a darker edge here, one that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The deeper she went, the more she could sense it. The shadow that lurked just beyond the reach of the light. It was growing, expanding like a living thing, crawling beneath the surface of the world, seeking its escape. Sarah could feel it pulling at the edges of her consciousness, like fingers scraping at the back of her mind. Wanted to be free. And she knew deep down that she had to stop it before it overwhelmed the balance she had worked so hard to maintain. She quickened her pace, her thoughts racing. What had the figure meant when it had said she could not control the forces she had awakened? She had created this world. She had woven light and shadow together, had breathed life into it. But now she understood. She was not its master. She was its steward, its caretaker. She had no dominion over it, only the responsibility to protect it, to guide it, and to listen to it. The forest seemed to close in around her as the shadows deepened. The trees grew more dense, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes, blocking out the remaining twilight. The path ahead became unclear, the underbrush thick with vines and brambles. The air was heavy with moisture, and the scent of damp earth filled her lungs as she pushed forward, her senses sharp and alert. The ground beneath her feet shifted slightly, the soft earth giving way to harder, jagged rocks. Sarah stumbled for a moment, her hand reaching out to steady herself against a stone. As her fingers brushed against the rough surface, she felt it, a pulse, faint but unmistakable. It came from deep within the earth, from the very core of the world she had created. Her heart raced as she pressed her palm against the stone, focusing on the pulse. It was rhythmic, steady, like the beating of a heart, but it was not her own. It was ancient, primal, a force that had been here long before she had woven this world into existence. She closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel the magic that hummed beneath the surface, flowing through the very earth itself. She could sense the threads of power interwoven with the land, but something else was there as well. Something dark. A presence. The shadow. She opened her eyes, and there, just ahead of her, she saw it. A glimmering, shifting form, barely visible in the dim light. It moved with an eerie fluidity, as though it were part of the very shadows themselves. For a moment, it was nothing more than a silhouette, a dark shape flitting between the trees. But then it began to grow, expanding, pushing against the edges of the forest, creeping into the space around her. The pulse in the earth grew stronger, more urgent, and Sarah could feel the shadows closing in around her. The figure was here. The darkness she had created was no longer contained. It had found a crack in the balance. It had found its way out. A rush of adrenaline surged through Sarah as she instinctively raised her hands, feeling the energy of the world flowing through her. She could sense the threads of light, the magic that she had woven into the land, and she reached out for it, calling it to her. The magic responded, flowing through her fingertips as the light began to spread out from her, illuminating the shadows that surrounded her. But the darkness did not retreat. It shifted, swirling around her, resisting the light, pushing against it, like a wave crashing against the shore. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of the struggle, and Sarah could feel the pull of the shadows as they tried to envelop her. The world she had created, the balance she had fought so hard to protect, was slipping through her fingers. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the roar of the shadows. "I won't let you destroy this." She called upon the light again, her hands outstretched, the magic gathering in her palms, but the darkness pushed back harder, growing stronger with every passing second. The forest around her seemed to pulse with it, the trees bending, their roots creaking as if in protest. The very earth was alive with the struggle, the balance teetering on the edge. Sarah's chest tightened with fear, but her resolve hardened. She had created this world. She had given it life, and she would not let it fall into ruin. She had to fight, not just with the light, but with everything she had woven into the land. She could not allow the darkness to consume it. She would not allow it to undo everything she had worked for. With a fierce cry, she pressed forward, her arms raised high, and the light that pulsed from her hands grew brighter, more intense, more focused. The darkness recoiled, but it was not enough. She could feel it still, like a living thing, wrapping itself around her, tugging at her, pulling at her very soul. But Sarah was not afraid. The darkness could not defeat her. She was its equal. She had the power to shape, to create, to protect. And she would not stop. Not now. Not ever. With a final, desperate push, she summoned the full force of the magic within her, and the light exploded outward in a brilliant flash, illuminating the forest with a blinding glow. The darkness shrieked, its form writhing and twisting in agony as the light enveloped it. For a moment, there was nothing but light, the pure, radiant force of creation that Sarah had called forth. And then the light faded. The darkness was gone. The world was still. And for the first time since she had created it, Sarah felt peace. But she knew it was only temporary. The battle was far from over. Sarah stood in the midst of the stillness that followed the storm of light. The world was quiet now, but it was not the peaceful quiet she had longed for. This silence was charged, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. The forest around her, once filled with the cacophony of life, was now hushed as if holding its breath. The trees no longer whispered, the wind no longer carried its familiar rustle through the leaves. Everything was still, frozen in time, waiting for something. She could feel it in the air, the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, still thrumming with the magic she had summoned. The very ground beneath her trembled, a low hum that seemed to echo deep within her bones. She had quelled the darkness for now, but she knew that this was not an end. It was only a brief lull before the inevitable return. The force she had fought against was not some simple shadow, not a mere opposing element that could be banished with a flash of light. It was part of the world itself, woven into its very fabric like a thread in a tapestry. Darkness was not her enemy, it was a part of the balance, and to fight it with brute force was to risk tearing the fabric apart. The keeper's words echoed in her mind, louder now than ever before. You are not alone in this world. You are its creator, yes, but creation does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a web, a network of forces and energies that are beyond your comprehension. The balance you seek to protect is not just the balance of light and shadow. It is the balance of all things, life and death, creation and destruction, hope and despair. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep into her heart. She had acted out of fear, out of the primal instinct to protect the world she had created. But what she had done, the light she had summoned, was not enough. The darkness had only retreated, not been destroyed. It would return, and it would return stronger if she didn't learn to understand it, to live with it, just as she lived with the light. This was the cost of creation. The pulse of the earth beneath her feet was not the pulse of her creation alone. It was something older, something that had existed long before she wove this world into being. It was the pulse of life itself, of creation and destruction in an eternal dance. The fabric of this world was not something she controlled. She was merely a part of it, a spark in the eternal flame. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. The time for brute force was over. She had to listen. She had to learn. And she had to do it before the darkness returned. Her gaze turned downward to the ground. The rocks beneath her feet, the soil, the roots of the trees, everything seemed to pulse with life. It wasn't the kind of life she had known in her past world. It was not the life of human beings or animals. It was something deeper, something more primal. It was the life force of the land itself. She reached down, her fingers brushing against the rough stone beneath her. The pulse was stronger here. She could feel it vibrating through her fingertips, deep in the heart of the world. Her connection to the land was not just physical, it was spiritual too. The power she had wielded, this magic, this force that had been awakened in her, was not hers alone. It was part of everything, and she needed to understand it. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint whisper, a voice soft and distant but unmistakable. Listen. Sarah lifted her head, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was not the keeper's, nor was it the shadows. It was a voice older than either, the very voice of the land. She closed her eyes, focusing, listening. The balance is not yours to command, the voice said, its tone both gentle and firm. You have shaped the land, yes. You have breathed life into it. But you must learn to listen, to understand, to work with the forces you have awakened. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, the vibrations deepening. The trees around her groaned softly, their branches swaying as if in answer to the call of the earth. She could feel the pulse of the forest, the heartbeat of the world, reverberating through her very soul. The darkness you fought is part of the balance, the voice continued. It is not an enemy. It is not a thing to be destroyed. It is a force that must be understood, integrated into the whole. You cannot protect this world by fighting it. You must learn to live with it as you live with the light. Only then will you understand the true nature of creation. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was not what she had expected. She had thought that the struggle was simple, that light could conquer dark, that her magic could push away the shadows. But she had learned, in the deepest part of herself, that it was never that simple. The world she had created was not just a reflection of her will. It was something far greater, far more intricate. And the forces that shaped it were beyond her control. She opened her eyes, taking in the vast expanse of the forest before her. It stretched out, limitless, alive with possibility. The trees towered above her, their trunks thick and ancient, their leaves rustling in the wind. The sky above was a deepening blue, the first stars of evening beginning to twinkle in the sky. The forest was at peace, for now. But she knew it was not truly at peace. Not yet. Not until she learned to understand the forces she had awakened, until she learned to work with them, not against them. The wind picked up again, stirring the leaves in the trees, sending a cool breath across her face. It carried with it the scent of rain, distant but growing nearer. The storm that had been brewing in the distance was coming. She could feel the energy in the air shift, the charge of the atmosphere growing stronger, crackling with tension. There was a warning. But what was the storm warning her of? The pulse of the earth beneath her feet grew more urgent, the ground trembling again. This time, it wasn't the trembling of a mere earthquake or the aftershock of magic. This was something different. Something was coming, something far beyond her understanding. Sarah's heart began to race. She could feel it, the tension in the air, the unease that was settling deep into her bones. The storm was not just a storm. It was a sign, a harbinger of something that had been set into motion long before she had ever stepped foot in this world. The land was alive, but it was not static. It was constantly shifting, evolving, growing, and she was caught in the middle of it. Her thoughts turned to the figure that had appeared to her before, the one who had warned her about the balance. She had been foolish to think that she could control this world, that she could shape it with her own hands and force it into her image. The world was not hers to command. She had merely given it form. The forces that lived here, light and shadow, life and death, creation and destruction, they were beyond her. And to fight against them would be to destroy herself, to destroy the very thing she had created. She could feel it now, the storm approaching faster, the winds picking up, swirling around her. The pulse of the earth was louder, more insistent, vibrating through her chest. And then a single thought broke through the chaos. I must learn. She closed her eyes again, letting the pulse of the world flow through her, letting it carry her away. She would learn to listen, to understand the forces that shaped this land. She would learn to live with the darkness, to work with it just as she had worked with the light. Her hands outstretched, she focused all her energy, all her attention on the pulse of the world. The storm was coming. But this time she was not afraid. This time she would face it head on. And as she did, the world shifted once more, the pulse of the earth and sky merging together, the storm unleashing its full force as Sarah embraced it. The storm was upon her before she had time to brace for it. The air exploded with energy, thick and charged, as if the very sky had been torn open and was now spilling its wrath upon the world. The wind howled through the forest, sending the trees into a violent dance, their branches groaning under the pressure. The first droplets of rain came not as a soft mist, but as a barrage, sharp and heavy like needles of ice striking the earth. Thunder rumbled overhead, shaking the air with its deep, resonant growl, as if the heavens themselves were warning her. But Sarah stood firm. The storm wasn't just a natural occurrence, it was something else. She could feel the force of it, the pulse of energy that connected it to the world itself. The rain wasn't simply falling, it was alive, part of the vast web of energy she had woven into the fabric of creation. The wind wasn't just blowing, it was a messenger carrying the whispers of the earth, the sky, and the darkness beneath it all. Sarah closed her eyes and reached out with her senses, trying to feel the threads of magic that bound everything together. The pulse of the earth was still there, still humming beneath her feet, but now it was joined by the storm, the rain, the wind, the crackling energy in the air. It was like a chorus, a symphony of forces, all working in tandem, all speaking to her, urging her to listen, to understand. The storm wasn't a thing to be feared. It was a part of the world she had created. It was a reflection of the balance she was still struggling to comprehend. The forces of nature, the elements, were not enemies to be conquered. They were partners in the delicate dance of life, each one playing its part in the cycle of creation and destruction. The storm, like the darkness she had battled, was a necessary part of the whole. It was not something to be pushed away. It was something to be embraced. Sarah raised her arms to the sky, feeling the rain pour down on her, soaking her to the bone. The storm surged around her, its intensity growing with every passing second, but she did not flinch. She had to learn. She had to understand. The power of the storm was not hers to control. It was part of the land, part of the world she had shaped. But it was also a force that needed to be respected, just as the darkness did. Her mind raced as she stood there, drenched in the fury of the storm. The energy around her was intoxicating, wild and free, and yet there was something in it. A rhythm, a pulse, a pattern. It wasn't chaos. It was controlled chaos, if such a thing existed. The storm was part of the web of life, the endless cycle of growth and decay, creation and destruction. But there was more. She could feel it now, a shift in the energy, a change that was deep and unsettling. The storm wasn't just a storm. It was a manifestation of something larger, something older. The pulse beneath her feet had changed too. It was no longer just the rhythm of the earth. It was something deeper, more ancient, like a heartbeat that had been steady for eons, but now was faltering, uncertain. It was the world itself, but something was wrong. Something was out of balance. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, and Sarah felt it whip through her hair, pulling at her clothes. The rain fell harder, as if trying to drown her, but she stood tall, unwavering. The storm was not trying to harm her. It was trying to tell her something. She had learned that much from the darkness. The forces of nature, the forces of creation, they did not act out of malice. They acted to maintain balance, to keep the world in motion. And now the balance was shifting. The storm, the earth, the very air around her, they were trying to warn her. She could feel it, the tug at the edges of her mind, the pull of something deep within the earth. It was the same pull she had felt before, the presence of the darkness, but now it was something more. It was not just a force lurking beneath the surface. It was rising, pushing its way through the web of magic, trying to break free, trying to consume everything in its path. The storm was its herald. A flash of lightning split the sky, blinding in its intensity, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She felt it then, the sudden rush of energy, the surge of power that swept through the storm and into the very earth beneath her. The pulse of the world was no longer steady. It was erratic, like the beat of a heart that had just begun to falter. The darkness was rising, and it was stronger now, more insistent, more desperate. Her eyes flew open, and she could see the storm in its full fury. The sky was a swirling mass of clouds, dark and tumultuous, and the wind whipped through the trees, their branches bending and breaking beneath the pressure. The earth beneath her feet seemed to tremble with each flash of lightning, each crack of thunder. It was as if the very world was convulsing, struggling against something ancient, something powerful. Sarah's breath quickened, and she knew that the time had come. The balance was no longer something she could protect with light alone. She had to confront the darkness again, but this time she had to understand it. She had to face it on its terms. She couldn't simply push it away. She had to accept it. With that thought, Sarah felt the shift within her. The magic that had been coursing through her, the power she had used to shape the world, it was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't just light now. It was something else, something darker, something more primal. She reached for it, reaching deep within herself, drawing it out. The energy surged through her, rushing to her fingertips, but it wasn't just light. It was the storm, the earth, the darkness. It was everything woven together, a web of power and energy that she could feel in her bones. She wasn't controlling it. She wasn't bending it to her will. She was becoming it, merging with it, understanding it. The storm around her seemed to pause, the wind dying down, the rain falling in a slow, rhythmic pattern. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence, a stillness so profound that Sarah could hear the beating of her own heart. And then, with a surge, the energy exploded from her, cascading outward, spreading through the forest, through the land. The storm responded. The wind howled once more, the lightning flashed again, but this time it wasn't just destructive. It was controlled, contained, as if the storm itself had been tamed, not by force, but by understanding. The rain fell in sheets, but it no longer felt like a deluge. It was cleansing, renewing, washing away the tension in the air. The pulse of the earth steadied. The darkness retreated, not because she had banished it, but because she had embraced it. She had accepted it as part of the balance, and in doing so, she had restored the harmony that had been lost. But even as the storm began to calm, Sarah knew that the balance was fragile. This was only a temporary peace. The forces of creation, of light and shadow, were always in motion, always shifting. And she would have to keep moving with them, keep listening, keep learning. She wasn't done yet. This world wasn't done yet. The storm began to subside, the wind dying down, the rain softening into a gentle mist. The sky, though still heavy with clouds, no longer felt threatening. The world had shifted, yes, but it had not been torn apart. The balance had been restored. For now. Sarah took a deep breath, the cool air filling her lungs. She had learned something important today, something that would guide her in the days to come. She had created this world, yes, but she had not created it in isolation. She was part of it just as it was part of her. The darkness, the storm, the earth, they were all part of the web that held this world together. And she had to listen. Always listen. The rain continued to fall, soft and steady now, as Sarah turned and began to walk deeper into the forest. There was much more to understand, much more to learn. The balance was delicate, but it was hers to protect. And as long as she listened, as long as she respected the forces that shaped this world, she would find a way to maintain it. For as long as she could. Sarah moved deeper into the forest, the air now cool and fresh after the storm's wrath. The trees seemed to breathe again, their branches slowly swaying as if waking from a long, restless sleep. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, leaving the ground slick and the leaves heavy with water. The earth smelled of damp moss and wood, the scent of life rejuvenated by the storm's cleansing. And yet, as Sarah walked, a nagging sense of something lurking beneath the surface gnawed at her. The balance had been restored, but it was only temporary, and the forces she had touched, both light and shadow, were not simply things she could hold in check. Her footsteps were soft on the wet earth, but there was a quiet urgency in the way she moved. The storm had been a warning, a reminder that the world was not as simple as she had once believed. The darkness she had fought was not just an enemy to be fought off. It was a necessary part of the cycle. And while she had learned to embrace it, to understand it as part of the greater whole, there was still much more to learn. The forces that shaped this world were not just abstract concepts. They were living, breathing things. And they could not be controlled. As Sarah walked, the forest seemed to shift around her. The trees, though they had once been stoic and still, now whispered. She could feel the pulse of the world in the air around her, a steady hum that grew louder as she walked. The path she followed wound deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser, their trunks thicker, their roots twisted in intricate patterns beneath the soil. The air felt heavier here, filled with the thick scent of earth and the sweet, almost intoxicating fragrance of unknown flowers. Every step she took, the forest seemed to grow more ancient. The canopy above grew darker as the trees thickened, their branches twisting into gnarled shapes, their leaves turning a deep shade of green that seemed to absorb the light. It was here, in this deeper part of the forest, that Sarah could feel the true weight of the land pressing down on her. She was no longer simply a visitor in this world. She had become a part of it, entwined with it in ways she could not fully understand. The air was thick with magic now, more than it had ever been before. It wasn't just the light that pulsed through the forest, but something else, something older, something that resonated deep within the earth itself. She could feel it, like a hum beneath her skin, like the heartbeat of the land. The storm had awakened something in her, a deeper connection to the forces that ran through the world. She wasn't just a creator anymore. She was a conduit, a bridge between the world's raw energies and the balance they required. And yet, despite the profound beauty and harmony that the storm had restored, there was something unsettling about it all. A deep, primal unease gnawed at Sarah's insides. Something had shifted during the storm. She could feel it in the air, in the very way the land responded to her presence. The balance was not fully restored, not yet. Something lingered, something unsettled. The pulse of the earth was still there, steady and strong, but it was different now, warped. She stopped for a moment, her gaze drifting up to the canopy above. The rain had stopped completely now, and the mist from the forest hung in the air like a veil, diffusing the pale light of the moon. The air felt thick with the weight of history, of secrets long buried. It was as if the trees themselves were watching her, waiting, as if the forest itself was aware of her presence, aware of the shift that had just occurred. Sarah felt the pull again, deeper this time, stronger. It was the same tug she had felt when the storm had begun, the same pull that had drawn her to the heart of the forest. But now it was more insistent, more urgent. It was coming from deeper within the forest, from beyond the place where the trees grew thick and the shadows grew long. She hesitated for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. Something inside her warned her not to go any further, but she knew she had to. The world was calling her, urging her to move forward, to face what lay ahead. The darkness was not gone. It had not been defeated. It had merely retreated into the depths, waiting for the right moment to rise again. With a quiet resolve, Sarah stepped forward, following the pull that had become a force of its own. The deeper she went into the forest, the more she felt the land shift around her. The trees, once so familiar, now seemed foreign, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, the dark shadows beneath them growing longer and more menacing. The air grew colder as she moved deeper into the unknown, the mist swirling around her ankles like the breath of something ancient. She had learned to accept the balance of light and shadow, but now she felt that she had reached the boundary between the two, where neither side reigned supreme. This place was not a place of harmony. It was a place of conflict, a place where the forces that governed the world battled in silence. And she had no choice but to witness it, to understand it, to see it for what it was. Her senses heightened as she moved forward, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of moss and fallen leaves. The trees were growing taller now, their trunks wider, their branches so thick that the sky above was all but obscured. The deeper she moved, the darker it became. The forest felt alive with something else, something older, something that had existed long before she had woven her creation into existence. And then she saw it. It was a clearing, though it felt less like a place of openness and more like an opening into something else, something beyond. The air around the clearing was heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The trees at the edges of the clearing were bent, their branches twisted into grotesque shapes, their trunks hollowed out and gnarled. The ground was cracked and broken, and in the center of the clearing was a stone altar, worn by centuries of time, its surface slick with the residue of something long forgotten. Sarah stopped at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel it now, the power that radiated from the altar, the ancient magic that had been bound here, long before she had come to this world. This was the source. This was the heart of the disturbance, the heart of the darkness she had felt pulling at her, the heart of the unbalance that had crept into the world. She stepped forward, slowly, cautiously, as though stepping into a forbidden space. The ground beneath her feet felt uneven, as though the earth itself was unsettled. The pulse of the land had grown stronger, more erratic, and the darkness that had once felt so distant was now closing in, filling the clearing with an oppressive weight. It was as though the shadows were alive, moving, reaching for her. Sarah stopped just in front of the altar, her breath catching in her throat. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of ancient things that had long been forgotten. But it wasn't just the physical decay she sensed, it was something else. Something spiritual, something primal. The magic here, though old, was not dormant. It was awake, alive, and it was calling to her. She reached out with trembling fingers, her hand hovering just above the altar. The power that radiated from it was immense, overwhelming, but it was not the kind of magic she had used to create this world. It was raw, unrefined, a force that had been trapped here, hidden away for centuries. And now it was trying to break free. Before she could make contact, a voice, deep and resonant, filled the clearing, echoing in her mind. "You have come." Sarah's heart skipped a beat and she stepped back, her hand pulling away from the altar. The voice was not one she recognized. It was not the keeper, nor was it the shadow she had fought. It was something older, something far more ancient. "You are the one who has shaped this world," the voice continued, its tone a mixture of awe and menace. "But you do not understand what you have done. You have awakened forces beyond your comprehension. Forces that cannot be contained. Forces that will tear this world apart." Sarah's breath quickened as she turned in the direction of the voice, but the clearing was empty. The air felt thick with magic, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was closing in on her. "You cannot stop it," the voice whispered, its words like the hiss of wind through the trees. "The balance has already been broken. The storm was only the beginning. The darkness will rise again, and this time, it will consume everything." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she stood firm. She was no longer the scared creator, the one who had sought to control the world with only light. She had learned the truth. The darkness could not be destroyed. It had to be understood, embraced as part of the natural order of things. The voice fell silent, and the clearing seemed to quiet in response, but the weight of its presence lingered. Sarah stood before the altar, her pulse still racing, her mind spinning with the realization that this was just the beginning. The balance had been broken, yes, but it had been broken for a reason. The forces of creation were not static. They were always in motion. And it was her responsibility, no, her destiny, to learn how to live with them. The silence in the clearing was deafening. Sarah stood frozen, her pulse racing as the realization of what she had just encountered settled deep into her bones. The voice, the presence, had spoken to her with a certainty that left no room for doubt. The balance was indeed broken, but not by her hand alone. It had been fractured long before she had ever arrived in this world. She was only the catalyst, the spark that had ignited a flame that could no longer be contained. The dark energy that pulsed from the altar wrapped itself around her like a tightening coil, and for a moment, Sarah's vision blurred. The air grew thicker, as though the very atmosphere had become saturated with magic, old, twisted magic that had lain dormant for centuries. She could feel it like a weight pressing down on her chest, filling her lungs with the taste of something ancient, something primal. The earth beneath her feet trembled again, but this time, it was not a gentle vibration. It was violent, as though the land itself was writhing in pain, trying to shake loose the remnants of a curse that had been bound to this place long ago. The voice, no, the presence, spoke again, its tone now tinged with an unmistakable bitterness. "You have awakened it. You have breathed life back into something that should have stayed forgotten." Sarah's body tensed, her hands instinctively clenching into fists. She could feel the pull of the darkness again, but this time, it was stronger, more insistent. The veil that had once separated the forces of light and shadow had been ripped open, and she had walked straight into the heart of it. But this was no longer the familiar battle of light against dark. It was something far more complex, something that transcended the simplistic dichotomy of good versus evil. The forces that had been set into motion were neither inherently good nor evil. They were simply forces, powerful, ancient, and indifferent to the labels that humans had placed upon them. "You cannot control me," the voice continued, its words like a cold wind sweeping through the clearing. "You are not its master, no more than the wind is the master of the trees. You are a part of this world, yes, but so am I." Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had created this world, woven it from nothing, and now she was standing at the heart of it, confronting the very forces she had awakened. She had feared the darkness, had fought it, but now she understood. It was not her enemy. It was part of the balance. The storm had been a warning. The battle between light and shadow was not a battle at all. It was a dance, a delicate interplay between forces that had to coexist. She stepped closer to the altar, her feet pressing softly against the wet earth, feeling the ancient power that radiated from the stone. The air around her crackled with energy, the magic within the forest responding to her presence. The darkness was not something to be feared, but something to be understood. She had fought against it before, but now she saw it for what it truly was, an elemental force just like the wind, the rain, or the sun. It was not something that could be vanquished or erased. It was a part of the world, a force that existed alongside light, as natural and inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Sarah's eyes flickered to the altar, and she could feel the pulse of the ancient magic beneath her feet, still strong, still present. The stone was old, worn by time, yet it hummed with power as if it had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to come and awaken it. It was a key, a conduit between the world of light and the world of shadow. A threshold, a doorway. "You do not understand," the voice growled, now growing fainter, as though it was slipping further into the recesses of her mind. You are a creature of the light. You cannot comprehend the depths of the darkness. Sarah's gaze hardened. She had been a creature of light, yes, but she had learned. She had become part of this world, part of the balance. She was no longer the creator who stood apart, looking down on her creation. She was woven into the fabric of it, every thread of her being entwined with the land, the magic, the forces of life and death. And the darkness, though terrifying, was just as much a part of her world as the light. It was not her adversary. It was her counterpart, the yin to her yang, the shadow to her light. The land trembled again, this time with a force that made the trees around her groan, their branches creaking and cracking as if the very forest itself was in pain. The clearing felt like it was shrinking, the air tightening around her, as though the earth itself was trying to push her back. Sarah's heart pounded, but she remained still, rooted to the spot. She was not afraid anymore. Fear had been a part of her before, but she had outgrown it. Now she was ready to face what had always been here, waiting in the shadows. She reached out with her senses, letting the pulse of the earth, the rhythm of the land, flow through her. The darkness swirled at the edges of her awareness, a presence just beyond her reach. She could feel it, see it now, not as a malevolent force, but as an ancient energy, a raw power that had been dormant, hidden away for far too long. It was a force of creation and destruction, of birth and decay, of endings and beginnings. It was the very stuff of life, as much a part of the cycle as the dawn and the dusk. She extended her hand, palm outstretched toward the altar, and she felt it, the connection. The magic, both light and dark, surged through her, filling her veins with an intensity that made her chest tighten. The power was overwhelming, but it wasn't frightening. It was exhilarating, like a storm rolling through the sky, full of potential, full of possibility. She could feel the land shifting beneath her feet, its pulse syncing with her own, the ancient energies of the world rising to meet her. The altar before her began to glow, faintly at first, but with growing intensity. The stone seemed to come alive, its surface shimmering with energy, as though it were awakening after a long, deep sleep. The shadows around her deepened, swirling around the altar like tendrils of smoke, coiling and twisting in the air. The forest around her grew darker still, the mist swirling in on itself, gathering near the altar like a storm cloud. Sarah closed her eyes and breathed deeply, drawing the power of the land into her being. She was no longer just a creator. She was part of this world, bound to it by the very magic that pulsed through it. The darkness and the light were two sides of the same coin, and she had to learn to embrace both. "I understand," she whispered softly, her voice carrying through the air, blending with the wind. "I'm not here to control. I am here to understand." There was a sudden stillness, a breathless pause that seemed to stretch on forever, as if the world itself was waiting for her next move. And then the voice responded, its tone softer now, tinged with something like acceptance. "Then you are ready." The altar's glow intensified, and for the briefest moment, the world around her seemed to shudder, like a ripple passing through the fabric of reality itself. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the air filled with the scent of earth and rain, of new beginnings. The darkness, no longer an enemy, began to recede, its presence no longer suffocating. Instead, it seemed to blend with the light, coexisting in perfect harmony. Sarah stood there in the heart of the forest, her hand outstretched toward the altar. The world around her had changed, shifted, but she knew that this was only the beginning. She had embraced the balance, accepted the darkness as a part of the cycle. And now the world would move forward, its forces no longer in conflict, but in alignment. But there was one thing Sarah understood above all else. This was not an end. This was a new beginning. The forces of creation, of light and dark, would continue to shape the world just as they always had. And Sarah, now not just a creator but a steward, would walk alongside them, listening, learning, and helping to maintain the delicate balance that kept the world alive. The storm had passed, the darkness had retreated, and the forest, though still ancient and full of mystery, was at peace, for now. The mist that lingered in the clearing began to dissipate, drifting away like the last remnants of an old dream. The air was now thick with a strange, quiet energy, the kind that follows after a storm has passed, when the world feels heavier, as though it's caught between breaths. The trees, their trunks darkened by the rain, seemed to stand even taller, more ancient than before, as though they too had witnessed the delicate shift in the world's rhythm. Sarah's heart still raced in her chest, the lingering power of the altar still vibrating beneath her skin. The pulse of the earth had calmed, but it was no longer the same steady, gentle beat it had been when she first entered the forest. It was stronger, more insistent, like the heartbeat of a creature awakening from a long slumber. And she knew, without a doubt, that the forest was alive in ways she had never fully understood. It wasn't just a collection of trees and soil, rivers and rocks. It was a being, an organism, a living force that responded to the energies around it. The clearing, once oppressive with its ancient power, now felt strangely serene. The shadows had retreated, no longer clinging to the edges of the world, but allowing the moonlight to filter down through the branches. The soft glow of the stone altar, now dimming, remained a constant reminder of what had transpired. The forces of the world had been irrevocably changed, and Sarah knew it was a change that would reverberate throughout the land. As she stood there, her hands still hovering above the altar, she felt the weight of the forest around her, felt the way the trees reached toward her, not with their branches but with their roots, their spirits, their life force. She had always believed that she was the creator of this world, but now she understood the truth. She was not its sole architect. She was merely a part of it. The forest, the earth, the sky, and the darkness, they were not separate from her but woven into her very being. And it was in that realization that she saw her true purpose. She had feared the darkness, had tried to control it, to push it away. But it wasn't something that could be controlled. It was not something to be feared. It was part of the cycle. Just as the night follows the day, as death follows life, the shadow follows the light. The balance wasn't something she could create or destroy. It was something she had to live with, to accept, to protect. Sarah stepped back from the altar, her eyes scanning the forest around her. Felt different now. The very air seemed alive with the pulse of magic, as if the storm had unlocked something deep within the land. The forest had changed, and so had she. She had learned to listen, to understand the forces that govern this world. And in doing so, she had found a new purpose. Her gaze drifted back to the altar, its surface now dark and lifeless. But she could still feel the power that had once surged through it, the power that had called to her, that had pulled her deeper into the forest. She had touched something ancient here, something powerful. And as she stood there, the weight of the world pressing in on her, she knew that the changes she had wrought were not yet complete. The balance had been restored, but there were still lessons to be learned. She turned away from the altar, moving deeper into the forest. The trees around her seemed to part, opening a path that had not been there before. The forest was welcoming her, guiding her forward, but where was it leading her? What else did she need to understand? The further she walked, the more the forest seemed to change. The mist grew thicker, wrapping itself around her like a veil, obscuring the path ahead. The shadows deepened, and the air grew heavier, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something faintly metallic like blood. The further she went, the less familiar the trees seemed. Their branches twisted into shapes that felt unnatural, like hands reaching toward her from the darkness. The very ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, as though the earth was alive, moving, watching. The air felt charged again, and Sarah's steps slowed, her senses alert. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle changes that came when something powerful, something ancient, was close. And she realized with a shock that she was no longer simply walking through the forest. She was being drawn deeper toward something or someone. The forest was guiding her, but to where? And what? As she rounded a bend in the path, she saw it. It was a clearing, but unlike the one she had left behind. This one was dark, the shadows heavy and oppressive, as if the very trees around it were pressing in, suffocating the light. The ground was uneven, cracked in places, as though it had been torn apart and stitched back together. At the center of the clearing stood a massive stone structure, taller than any of the trees, its surface covered in strange symbols and carvings that seemed to pulse with an eerie glow. The air around it was thick with an ancient energy, a power that radiated outward like the beating of a dark heart. Sarah stopped at the edge of the clearing, her heart thudding in her chest. She knew, without being told, that this place was important, that it was connected to everything she had just learned, to the forces that had shaped this world. It was the source, the heart of the balance she had been called to protect. The stone structure was no ordinary monument. It was a gateway, a threshold between the world of light and the world of shadow. It was a place where the forces she had struggled to understand had been held in check, where the balance had been maintained for centuries. But now that balance was slipping. The storm, the darkness, the changes she had wrought, they had disturbed something here. And this place, this stone structure, was where it all began. She approached it slowly, cautiously, her breath shallow as she neared. The symbols carved into the stone seemed to shift as she drew closer, their forms changing in the flickering light. It was as though the stone was alive, reacting to her presence. The power within it pulsed, not like a heartbeat, but like something older, something deeper. She could feel it in her chest, in her bones, in the very marrow of her being. She reached out a hand, trembling slightly, and placed it against the cool surface of the stone. The moment her skin touched it, a jolt of energy shot through her, sending a wave of raw power coursing through her body. She gasped, her eyes widening as the world around her seemed to blur, the edges of reality fraying and twisting. The stone pulsed under her hand, and with it, the forest around her seemed to wake, the trees groaning as if they too felt the surge of power. "You should not have come here." The voice, deep and resonant, not unlike the one she had heard before, spoke again, but this time, it was not inside her mind. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very air, from the stone itself. It was a warning. Sarah pulled her hand back, her heart racing, but the voice did not relent. "This place is not for you. You are not ready for what lies beyond. The balance you seek to protect is not just of light and dark. It is a balance of power, a power that has been here long before you ever breathed life into this world. It cannot be controlled, not by you, not by anyone." Sarah stood tall, her breath steadying. She had come this far. She had learned to embrace the forces that shaped this world. She had accepted the balance. And now it was time to confront the next step. She had to understand this power, this ancient force. She had to learn how to live with it, just as she had learned to live with the darkness. "I am ready," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. For a long moment there was silence. Then the stone began to glow brighter, its symbols shifting and changing before her eyes. The air grew thick, and Sarah could feel the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, faster now, more frantic. The voice spoke one last time, its tone almost mournful. "Then you will see." The air around Sarah crackled with energy, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. The stone beneath her fingertips began to hum, vibrating in response to the pull of her presence. It was as if the very fabric of reality was shifting, realigning itself in response to her touch. The symbols carved into the stone began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light, their edges pulsing like the beating of a heart. The clearing, once a place of shadows and decay, now seemed alive, a living organism that was breathing in rhythm with the earth itself. Sarah stepped back from the altar, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her pulse raced in her chest as the power coursed through her veins, like a river that had suddenly burst its banks, flooding her senses. The world around her seemed to blur and twist, the boundaries between the physical and the mystical growing increasingly thin. She could feel the energy of the forest, the trees, the ground, the very air itself, surging toward the altar as though they too were drawn to the power that now radiated from the stone. She stood at the precipice of something vast, something ancient. The voice that had spoken to her earlier had warned her, had tried to dissuade her from continuing, but she knew now that she could not stop. She had come this far and there was no turning back. The forces she had awakened, the balance she had disrupted, had all led her to this moment. The knowledge that had been buried deep within her was rising to the surface, and she felt as though she was on the brink of something monumental. The wind began to pick up again, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the gentle breeze that had accompanied her journey through the forest. No, this wind was alive, alive with the same energy that had surged through the altar. It howled through the trees, sending leaves swirling into the air, the branches shaking as though the trees themselves were in turmoil. The ground beneath Sarah's feet trembled, sending small cracks through the earth, as if the very foundation of the forest was coming undone. And then, with a sudden and deafening roar, the clearing erupted in light. It wasn't a flash, a brief burst of brilliance. No, it was a torrent, a flood of pure energy that exploded outward, filling the entire clearing with blinding radiance. The stone altar at the center of the clearing glowed like a beacon, its symbols now shimmering with an intensity that made Sarah's eyes water. The light was overwhelming, and for a moment she thought she might be consumed by it. But she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She stood her ground, feeling the power wash over her, filling her, suffusing every cell with energy. The forest was alive with the light. The trees, the ground, the very air, it was all vibrating, all pulsing with a force that was both exhilarating and terrifying. It was as if the world had cracked open, revealing the raw heart of existence itself. The forest, once a place of shadows and whispers, now felt vast, infinite, as if the boundaries of the world had dissolved. There was no longer a sense of separation, no longer a distinction between Sarah and the land, the trees, the very energy that flowed through the earth. For a moment, Sarah lost herself in the light, in the sheer magnitude of the power that surrounded her. It was as though time had stopped, as though she had become part of something much larger than herself. She could feel the ancient pulse of the earth beneath her feet, the rhythm of the world that had been there long before her, and she understood in that instant that she was not the creator she had once believed herself to be. She was a part of the world, no more, no less. The magic she had awakened, the forces of light and dark, were not hers to control. They were the very essence of existence, the breath of life itself. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light began to fade. The radiance that had filled the clearing slowly dimmed, retreating back into the stone, until only a faint glow remained. The air settled, the wind died down, and the world returned to its familiar state. The trees, the earth, the very ground beneath her feet seemed to sigh in unison, as if releasing a breath they had been holding for centuries. The silence that followed was almost suffocating in its weight. The forest had changed irrevocably, and Sarah understood that she too had changed. She stumbled back a step, her head spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. The power had been overwhelming, but it was not just the power of the stone, the altar, or the forest. It was the power of the world itself, the raw, untamed forces that pulsed through everything, binding it together in a delicate web of life, death, and rebirth. She had not just witnessed it, she had become a part of it. She collapsed to her knees in the center of the clearing, her legs shaking as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The power still pulsed through her, though now it was more subtle, like the aftershock of an earthquake that reverberates long after the ground has settled. She could feel it, the magic that had been unleashed, the forces that had been set into motion. It was in the air she breathed, the ground beneath her, the trees that surrounded her. It was in her. For the first time in her life, she was no longer separate from the world. She had become one with it. And that realization was both terrifying and beautiful. The world was vast, more vast than she had ever imagined, and the forces that shaped it were beyond her comprehension. But she was no longer an outsider, a visitor in a world she had created. She was a part of it, intertwined with its magic, with its life force. And yet, even as Sarah sat there, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just occurred, she felt a stirring deep within her. The voice, the one that had warned her not to come here, had not disappeared. It still echoed in her mind, distant but present. "You are not ready." The words reverberated in the silence, a reminder that while she had made great strides in understanding the world, there was still much she did not know. The forces that governed the world were not simple. They were complex, multifaceted, and they were not something that could be controlled or fully understood. The darkness she had encountered, the storm, the shifting of the earth, all of it had been a test, a trial. But she now understood something she had not before. The darkness was not evil. It was not something to be vanquished. It was part of the natural order. But so was the light. The balance between the two was delicate, fragile. And that balance had been disturbed. Sarah stood slowly, her legs still unsteady beneath her. The clearing around her seemed quieter now, the power that had once filled the air now subdued. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders, the responsibility that had been placed upon her, whether she had chosen it or not. She was no longer just a creator. She was a guardian, a steward of the forces that had shaped this world. And her journey was far from over. The forest too had changed. The trees were no longer just trees, the soil no longer just soil. They were part of the great web of life, connected to everything in ways she had never fully understood. The magic that had once felt like a tool was now something far deeper. It was the essence of the world, the very force that sustained it. Sarah looked back at the altar, now dim and lifeless, its glow faded. The voice had fallen silent, but the words remained, etched in her mind. There was still so much to learn, so much to understand, and she was no longer afraid. For the first time in her life, she felt connected to the world, not just as its creator, but as its protector. She would face whatever came next, whatever trials awaited her, with the understanding that the balance of light and dark, creation and destruction, was not something to fear. It was something to honor. And so, Sarah took a step forward into the forest, her senses alive with the magic that flowed through everything. The world had changed. She had changed. And now her journey truly began. Sarah moved deeper into the forest, her senses heightened by the magic that still thrummed in her veins. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and the faint trace of something else, a lingering fragrance that reminded her of forgotten things, of ancient rituals and long-forgotten paths. The forest around her seemed to pulse with a new energy, the trees shifting and swaying as if they too were aware of the changes that had occurred. The whispers of the wind, once familiar, now carried with them the weight of ancient knowledge, secrets that had been locked away for centuries. The ground beneath her feet felt different now. The soil, once solid and firm, now seemed to ripple with an undercurrent of life, as though the very earth had awakened. Every step she took sent a tremor through the ground, the forest responding to her presence in ways it never had before. It was as though the world was alive with a consciousness of its own, and she too was now part of it. As Sarah continued along the path, the forest grew darker. The canopy above thickened, the trees intertwining to form a dense network of branches that blocked out most of the light. The shadows lengthened, creeping along the ground like silent watchers, their presence almost palpable. And yet Sarah felt no fear. The darkness no longer felt like an enemy. It was simply another aspect of the world, just as essential as the light. It was in her, around her, and through her. She had come to understand that the balance between the two was delicate, and that one could not exist without the other. The farther she walked, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees, once silent sentinels, now seemed to be watching her. Their trunks, thick and gnarled, were marked with deep scars, as if they had witnessed the passage of time in ways that no mortal creature could understand. The air around her was thick with the scent of decay, not of death, but of something far older. The forest had seen eons of growth, of life and death, and all of it was embedded in its very being. And then, as if in response to her thoughts, she heard it, a low, rumbling growl, deep and resonant, coming from somewhere in the distance. It was not the sound of an animal, but something far more ancient, more primal. The very air seemed to tremble with its vibrations, and Sarah instinctively halted, her senses alert. The growl grew louder, closer now, reverberating through the earth beneath her feet. It was a sound that vibrated through her chest, a low, resonant hum that spoke of power and ancient forces. The earth beneath her trembled again, but this time it was not the gentle tremor she had felt earlier. No, this was a warning. The ground shuddered as though the forest itself was protesting something, something that had been disturbed. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she did not turn back. She had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The presence that had guided her into this world, that had shown her the delicate balance of life and death, was leading her toward something. Something ancient. Something hidden beneath the surface of this world, buried deep within the earth. She took another step forward, her feet moving through the soft, moss-covered ground. The trees around her seemed to grow closer, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands, their shadows growing darker, longer, more oppressive. The growl, still distant, now seemed to echo in the very air, like a deep, resonating pulse that came from the earth itself. As she pushed through the dense undergrowth, Sarah noticed something else. The ground had begun to change. The soil, once rich and dark, was now cracked and dry, as though something had drained the very life from it. The trees around her had begun to wither, their leaves curling and browning, their bark cracking and peeling away. It was as though the very heart of the forest had begun to die, and something else was taking its place. A darkness was creeping through the land, corrupting the life that had once flourished here. Her hand instinctively reached for the pendant around her neck, the one that had once been a symbol of her connection to the magic of this world. She had worn it for so long, it had become a part of her, an anchor, a reminder of the balance she sought to protect. But now it felt cold, distant. The magic she had once drawn from it no longer flowed as easily. The energy around her had changed, and the pendant seemed to be a lifeline that was slowly slipping from her grasp. The growl, now unmistakable, echoed louder, a primal sound that vibrated through the earth, rattling the trees. Sarah stopped in her tracks, her heart racing as the ground beneath her feet trembled again. This time, the tremor was more violent, the very air around her crackling with static energy. Something was coming, something ancient, something powerful. In the distance, a shape began to emerge from the shadows, moving with a fluid grace that belied its immense size. It was a creature unlike any Sarah had ever seen before, a creature born from the heart of the forest itself. Its form was large, almost towering, its body a mass of twisted roots and dark, bark-like skin. Its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, the color of the moonlight that filtered through the trees. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its limbs extending and retracting like branches swaying in the wind. Its form was both terrifying and majestic, a living embodiment of the forest's raw power. The creature's presence was overwhelming, and Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. It was a guardian, she realized, a creature born of the forest itself, tasked with protecting the heart of the land. But something was wrong. The creature's glow, once a soft, ethereal light, now burned with an angry, erratic energy. The forest had begun to die, and it seemed that the guardian had been twisted by this corruption, its power warped and consumed by the darkness that had taken root in the land. As the creature drew closer, its growl grew louder, its massive form blocking out the light of the moon. Its eyes locked onto Sarah's, and in that moment she understood. This was the force she had felt, the one that had been disturbed. The balance had been shattered, and the forest was fighting to survive. The creature was not an enemy, not in the traditional sense. It was a force of nature, just as she had become. But it had been consumed by the same darkness that had begun to spread across the land. Sarah took a step forward, her heart racing. She knew that this was her test, her moment to confront the true nature of the forces she had awakened. The creature's eyes flickered with recognition, and for a brief moment she felt a deep connection, as if the creature understood what she had become. It was not a simple guardian. It was a force of nature, born from the forest itself, tied to the very magic that flowed through the world. And now, like her, it was fighting to survive. The growl softened, turning into something else, a low, mournful sound like a cry for help. Sarah took another step forward, her hand extended, the pendant around her neck pulsing with a faint, steady glow. She could feel the magic in the air, thick and heavy, swirling around her like a storm. The creature paused, its massive form still as though waiting for something. "You are not its enemy," Sarah whispered, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "You are part of this world just as I am. The balance can still be restored." The creature's eyes narrowed, its gaze shifting from her to the dying trees around them. The forest was in pain, and it was fighting to survive. She knew she could not do this alone. The darkness had to be purged, but she could not simply banish it. It was part of the world, and it had to be understood, embraced. She had learned that much. Now she had to find a way to heal the rift, to restore the balance before it was too late. The creature's growl softened even further, a rumbling vibration that seemed to echo in the very air. Sarah took one last deep breath, reaching out with all the magic she had learned to harness. The forest was alive with the pulse of life, of death, of rebirth. She could feel it, deep in her bones. The world was not as it seemed. The balance was not something to control. It was something to live with, to protect, to nurture. The air crackled with energy as Sarah knelt to the ground, placing her palm against the soil. She reached out with her mind, her spirit, and for the first time she felt the full weight of the world. The forces that bound it, the magic that flowed through it, and the darkness that sought to devour it. It was not an enemy. It was a part of the cycle. And as she stood before the guardian, the creature whose very essence was tied to the land, she understood. This was not a battle to win. This was a battle to heal. The world around Sarah seemed to hold its breath, the tension in the air thickening with every passing moment. The guardian before her, a creature forged from the very fabric of the forest, loomed in stillness, its eyes locked onto her as if it were searching for something. In its gaze, she could see the deep, ancient sorrow that permeated the forest itself. This wasn't just a beast standing in front of her. This was a manifestation of the forest's pain, of the land's suffering as the balance had been torn apart. And yet, it was more than that. It was a reflection of her own struggle, the darkness she had encountered within herself. For a long time, she had seen darkness as the enemy, something that needed to be cast away, banished to the edges of the world. But now she realized the darkness wasn't something to fear or erase. It was something to understand. It was as intrinsic to the fabric of life as the light itself. The guardian, the creature before her, was not the enemy. Its fury was born from the suffering of the land, its desperation to protect the heart of the forest from the encroaching void that threatened to consume it. The growl that had rumbled through the clearing softened further, until it was a mere whisper, a low vibration that resonated through Sarah's bones. She felt it, felt the weight of its power, its ancient essence. It wasn't just a guardian, it was a soul of the forest, a spirit that had lived for centuries, millennia perhaps, nurturing the land and watching over its delicate balance. And now it was reaching out to her, waiting for her to make a choice. Her breath slowed as she stepped closer, moving cautiously, her gaze never leaving the creature. She could feel the pull of the magic, the same raw, untamed energy that had surged through her when she first touched the altar. It was in the air, swirling around her like a living thing, urging her to take action. The darkness that had begun to consume the land wasn't something that could be fought with force. It was something that had to be healed, something that required understanding and compassion. She extended her hand toward the guardian, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. The creature's eyes flickered, a subtle change in its expression, but it didn't move. It was waiting for her to make the first move, waiting for her to prove that she understood. "You are part of this world, just as I am," she thought to herself, repeating the words she had spoken earlier. The connection between them, the bond that tied her to the forest, felt stronger now. The forest wasn't just alive in the way she had once thought. Its heartbeat, its life force, its very essence were intertwined with hers. She had awakened something deep within herself, something that allowed her to feel the pulse of the land. She could sense its pain, its fear, and in that moment she understood what needed to be done. The creature shifted slightly, a deep sigh escaping from its form. Its massive body, made of roots and bark, seemed to ripple with energy as it relaxed, if only for a moment. Sarah's heart beat faster in her chest as she stepped closer still, her hand now hovering just inches from the guardian's side. The wind shifted, sending a soft gust through the clearing, rustling the leaves and causing the trees to sway in response. The air was alive with magic, the very earth beneath her feet trembling in harmony with the pulse of the forest. She closed her eyes and let the energy wash over her, feeling the connections between the guardian, the forest, and herself become clearer. She reached out with her senses, letting the magic flow freely through her, and she felt the shift. Something ancient, something primal, deep within the earth. The land was crying out for help, and the guardian, in its own way, was trying to protect it. But it couldn't do it alone. She whispered the words she had learned from the forest, words she hadn't fully understood until now. Words that connected the light to the dark, that wove the forces of life and death together. It was the language of the land, the magic that had always existed in the spaces between things. "I am not here to fight," she said, her voice steady, though the air around her vibrated with raw energy. "I am here to restore the balance." The guardian's eyes narrowed, its form shifting ever so slightly as it regarded her. The air grew thick, the ground beneath them trembling with the force of the words she had spoken. The dark energy that had once felt suffocating now seemed to loosen, ebbing away like a mist in the morning sun. It wasn't gone, it would never be gone, but it was no longer the dominant force. It was merely part of the cycle, a force to be understood, embraced, and balanced. The creature stepped forward, its massive form looming over her, but there was no hostility in its movements now. Instead, there was an understanding, a shared recognition that they were both part of something much larger than themselves. The guardian lowered its massive head, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized it was acknowledging her, acknowledging that she had become part of the forest, part of the balance it needed to survive. She knelt before the creature, her hand brushing against the earth once more. She felt the pulse of the land beneath her, the ancient rhythmic thrum that had always been there. The darkness, the corruption that had seeped into the world, wasn't just an enemy. It was part of the cycle. It had always been part of the cycle. And now, she understood that the only way forward was to acknowledge that truth. As she pressed her palm to the earth, the ground beneath her seemed to respond, ripples of energy radiating outward from her touch. The roots of the trees seemed to reach down, seeking the balance that had been lost. The guardian's form shimmered as the light from the clearing flickered and dimmed, merging with the shadows that had once been feared. The world, the forest, seemed to exhale as if it were waking from a long, painful slumber. Sarah's body felt weightless as the energy from the earth surged through her, connecting her to the forest, to the guardian, to everything. The magic of the land flowed through her like a river, ancient and unyielding. And in that moment, she knew that this was what she had been meant to do all along, not to fight, but to heal. The balance of light and dark, creation and destruction, was fragile, but it was not something to be feared. It was something to be nurtured, something to protect. The clearing, once shrouded in darkness and fear, now seemed to glow with a soft, peaceful light. The mist that had hung low in the air dissipated, and the trees around them, once withered and decayed, began to pulse with new life. The leaves unfurled, green and vibrant, and the bark of the trees seemed to soften, their gnarled limbs reaching toward the sky as if they were stretching for the first time in centuries. The land was healing. The guardian, still towering over her, began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into the very earth it had once protected. Its roots, once twisted and gnarled, now seemed to melt into the soil, returning to the earth that had birthed it. And as the last remnants of the guardian's form faded away, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace settle within her, as though the forest had been reborn and she too had been reborn with it. The wind, which had been so fierce and wild, now calmed. The rain, which had once been a symbol of the forest's sorrow, now fell gently from the sky, a soft, cleansing shower that bathed the earth in cool relief. The night, once oppressive and dark, now felt like a gentle embrace, as though the forest had been reborn. Sarah stood slowly, her body still vibrating with the energy of the land. The pendant around her neck had warmed, its glow now steady and calm, and for the first time she felt the true meaning of her connection to the world. She wasn't just a creator anymore. She was a guardian, a steward of the balance that had been lost and now, at long last, restored. As she looked out over the now thriving forest, Sarah knew that the journey was far from over. The world was alive with magic, and there would always be challenges to face, forces of darkness to confront. But she also knew that she had learned the most important lesson of all, that the balance was not something to fear. It was something to protect. And in protecting it, she would protect the heart of the world itself. The forest around Sarah felt alive in a way that was almost indescribable. It wasn't just the trees or the soil or the streams that wound through the underbrush. It was the very air itself, thick with energy, as if the land were breathing in unison with her, as if every leaf, every gust of wind, every ripple in the water, was part of a song only she could hear now. The darkness that had threatened to overtake the land had been quelled, but not erased. Instead, it had been absorbed, woven into the tapestry of life in a way that felt natural, necessary. Sarah understood now deeply that both light and dark were essential to the forest's survival and to hers as well. Her connection to the forest had deepened in ways she hadn't anticipated. The air felt different against her skin, the scent of rain and earth mingling in a way that was almost intoxicating. The trees, tall and stoic, seemed to watch over her, their branches bending gently in the breeze. Even the shadows that had once been so menacing now felt like old companions, drifting lazily between the trunks of the ancient oaks and maples. The world around her was still shifting, changing, but it was not in a way that felt hostile. It was the natural order, growth, decay, rebirth. As she stood in the center of the clearing, her gaze drawn to the place where the guardian had once stood, Sarah realized that she had been forever changed by everything that had happened. She was no longer just a visitor in the forest, a wanderer trying to unlock the secrets of a world that seemed to pulse with ancient magic. No, she was now an integral part of it, a protector of the delicate balance between light and shadow, life and death. The journey had begun with uncertainty, fear, and the sense that she was out of place, but now she understood. She had always belonged here. The wind shifted, carrying the distant sound of something moving through the trees. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the noise, her senses alert. The forest had been quiet since the ritual, and any disruption in its stillness drew her attention. At first, she thought it might be an animal, a deer or a wolf perhaps, but the sound was too deliberate, too controlled. Someone, or something, was moving through the woods, and it wasn't the natural rhythm of the land. Her steps were light as she moved toward the sound, her body blending seamlessly with the shadows of the forest. The rain had slowed to a gentle mist, and the ground beneath her feet was soft, the moss cushioning each step. As she moved deeper into the woods, the air grew colder, and the once familiar scent of the forest was replaced with something sharper, something metallic. A new presence had arrived. She moved with quiet precision, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The forest was still healing, still vibrating with the magic she had awakened. She had barely begun to process the enormity of what she had done, and now, it seemed there was another challenge, one that would require everything she had learned to face. The trees began to thin as Sarah entered a small glade. The mist swirled around her feet, tendrils of vapor curling up to her knees. She paused, sensing that she was being watched, and her pulse quickened. Her instincts, honed over days of navigating the forest, told her that she was no longer alone. She could feel the presence behind her, waiting just beyond the edge of the mist. Slowly, cautiously, Sarah turned around. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. At first, it was difficult to make out as the figure blended into the shadows, but as Sarah's eyes adjusted to the dim light, she could see the outline of a person, a tall, slender figure cloaked in dark, tattered robes. The hood of the cloak was drawn up, casting the face of the figure in shadow, but Sarah could feel the presence, the energy radiating off of them. It wasn't just the energy of the forest or the earth. It was something darker, more unsettling. It was the power of something ancient, something that had existed long before Sarah had ever come to this place. The figure stood motionless, watching her, and Sarah's mind raced. Who was this? What did they want? Had they come to stop what she had done? The thought filled her with dread, but she could not allow fear to guide her actions. She had faced darkness before, and she would do so again if necessary. With a steady breath, Sarah called out to the figure, her voice firm yet cautious. "Who are you?" she asked. The words echoed through the still air, but there was no answer. The figure remained silent, but the energy around them seemed to intensify, as though the air itself was thick with the force of their presence. Sarah's gaze never left them, and she took a slow step forward. "Why have you come?" she asked again, her voice unwavering. This time, the figure shifted slightly, a subtle movement, and Sarah felt a jolt of recognition. This wasn't a stranger to her. It couldn't be. "Sarah?" a voice whispered, its tone deep and resonant. It wasn't loud, but the words seemed to reverberate through the air, carrying an ancient weight. The voice was familiar, but distant, as though it had been trapped in the forest for centuries. The figure slowly lowered their hood, revealing a face Sarah had not expected to see. It was a face she recognized, one she had seen in dreams and visions. The face of a woman, pale, with long dark hair and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light. The woman's eyes glimmered with ancient knowledge, and her features were sharp, almost ethereal. There was a power in her presence, a force that seemed to draw the very air around them into her orbit. But it was not the face of someone Sarah could trust. You are the one who called me here, Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. The woman smiled, but it was not a comforting smile. It was cold, calculating. Not called, but awakened, the woman replied, her voice laced with an almost imperceptible trace of bitterness. You did not understand what you were doing, child. You did not realize the weight of the power you unleashed. Sarah's heart raced as the words sank in. She had awakened something, yes, but she had done so with good intentions, with the hope of restoring balance. Could this woman be a force of darkness? Or was she something else entirely, something even older and more dangerous? What do you want? Sarah asked, her tone now defiant. The woman tilted her head, as though considering the question carefully. I want what was promised, she said softly. What was always mine to claim. The balance you seek to protect? It is but an illusion. I am the darkness, the one who has always been here, always lurking in the shadows. You may have pushed me back for now, but you will not stop me. You cannot. Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. The woman's words, filled with venom and resentment, sent a chill through her. She had thought the darkness was gone, that the forest had been healed. But here before her was proof that the true darkness was still very much alive. Leave, Sarah commanded, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of the energy she had harnessed. The forest has been restored. The balance is mine to protect. The woman's lips twisted into a cruel smile, her eyes gleaming with a ferocity that made Sarah's blood run cold. You misunderstand, child, she said, her voice now tinged with amusement. This forest, this world, they are mine. I am the one who shapes the cycles, who dictates the flow of life and death. You may have briefly interrupted the balance, but it is I who will reign. The air crackled with a dangerous energy, and Sarah could feel the ground beneath her feet shudder. This was not a battle of magic or strength. This was a battle of wills, of forces beyond comprehension. And as the shadows in the clearing seemed to stretch longer, darker, she realized the true scope of the threat that now stood before her. She wasn't just protecting the balance anymore. She was fighting for the survival of the forest and the world itself. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and Sarah could feel the full weight of her presence now, an overwhelming force that threatened to crush her. You cannot stop me, the woman repeated, her voice a low growl. Not alone. But Sarah stood firm. The darkness, as powerful as it was, had been disrupted once. And now, with everything she had learned, she knew she had the power to face it again. With a steady breath, she stepped forward, bracing herself for the storm that was about to come.